When my apartment went up in flames on a freezing Chicago night, I called my parents begging for a safe place to stay. My father coldly told me it was my own fault and hung up, leaving me shivering in the ashes of my life. What he did not know was that the fire investigator was about to hand me a piece of evidence pulled from the wreckage, a melted piece of solid gold that would not only expose the arsonist, but give me the exact weapon I needed to destroy my toxic family's entire empire. My name is Cassidy, 29 years old, and I own an independent fine art appraisal and restoration firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who discarded you when you needed them most. The temperature in Chicago had dropped to a brutal -10 degrees that January night. I stood on the icy pavement across the street from my apartment building, clutching a thin blanket a paramedic had wrapped around my shoulders. My teeth chattered violently, but I barely felt the biting cold. All my attention was fixed on the fourth floor of the brick building, where bright orange flames violently licked the black sky. Fire trucks blocked the intersection, their red and blue emergency lights flashing relentlessly against the snowbanks. Thick, acrid smoke filled my lungs with every breath. I had been running a successful independent fine art appraisal and restoration firm for 5 years. My apartment doubled as my personal sanctuary and workspace. Everything I had worked for, every piece of antique furniture I had carefully restored, all of it was turning into ash right before my eyes. I had barely escaped with the clothes on my back and my cell phone. As a section of the roof collapsed inward with a sickening crash, a profound wave of panic washed over me. I was completely alone in a disaster, and I had nowhere to go. In that moment of sheer desperation, I called my parents. My relationship with my parents, Thomas and Catherine, had always been transactional. Growing up in our meticulously manicured suburban estate, I learned very early that love was conditional. They were obsessed with social status, wealth, and maintaining an illusion of perfection. I was the independent daughter who chose to work with my hands restoring old paintings instead of marrying into old money. My younger sister Sienna was their golden child. At 26, Sienna was a professional shopper bankrolled by our parents, utterly entitled, and perfectly willing to play the role of the compliant daughter. When she married Jamal, a charismatic African-American insurance broker who knew exactly how to navigate financial loopholes, my parents treated their union like a corporate merger. They bought them luxury cars, funded their lavish lifestyle, and constantly compared my modest life to their glamorous facade. Despite the years of emotional distance and subtle rejections, I dialed my father's number. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely press the screen. Surely a devastating apartment fire would override our petty family politics. Surely seeing their eldest daughter standing homeless in the snow would awaken some basic parental instinct. The line clicked open. "Yes, what is it?" Thomas answered. His voice was thick with sleep and laced with immediate irritation. "Dad, there is a fire!" I said, my voice cracking as a fresh wave of smoke blew past me. "My apartment building is burning down. I lost everything. I am standing on the street in the freezing cold. Please, I need a place to stay tonight." There was a heavy pause on the line. I waited for the shock, the concern, the sudden rush of fatherly panic. I waited for him to ask if I was safe, if I needed him to drive down and get me. Instead, he let out a weary sigh. "This is not our problem, Cassidy," he said coldly. His tone was as flat and unfeeling as a concrete wall. "You chose to live in that cramped building in the city instead of the suburbs. You should have been more careful." I gripped the phone tighter, convinced I had misheard him. "Dad, I am not asking for money. I just need a roof over my head for a few hours. I am freezing." I heard shuffling in the background, followed by my mother's sharp, annoyed voice. Catherine must have taken the phone from him. "Cassidy, do you have any idea what time it is?" she scolded. "You are waking up the entire house. Sienna and Jamal are staying in the guest wing this weekend, and Jamal has a very important insurance seminar tomorrow. You are disrupting everyone's sleep with your drama." "Mom, my home is gone." I pleaded, tears spilling over my freezing cheeks. You are 29 years old, Catherine snapped back entirely unmoved. Act like an adult. Call an Uber and find a cheap motel somewhere. Do not drag your mess into this house. We have enough on our plates without dealing with your carelessness. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The dial tone echoed in my head, louder than the sirens surrounding me. In that single defining moment, the last remaining thread tying me to my family snapped completely. They had left me to freeze on a city street while they worried about my brother-in-law getting a good night's sleep. I tucked the phone back into my pocket and wrapped the scratchy blanket tighter around my shoulders. I had always known I was an outsider in their pristine world, but I had never fully grasped the depth of their callousness until now. They viewed me as a liability, an embarrassment, a failure who could not even keep a roof over her own head. I watched the firemen blast high-pressure water through what used to be my living room window. I realized then that my parents were exactly like the fire. They consumed everything around them, demanding fuel and attention, and left nothing but destruction for anyone who got too close. I would not call them again. I would not ask for another favor or another ounce of sympathy. As dawn began to break over the freezing Chicago skyline, painting the smoke clouds in bruised shades of purple and gray, I made a silent vow. I was going to rebuild my life from the ground up entirely on my own terms. I did not need their suburban mansion, their conditional love, or their toxic approval. I was walking away from the ashes, entirely unaware that the fire investigator was about to approach me with a discovery that would soon turn my tragedy into the ultimate weapon of retribution. The flashing red and blue lights of the fire engines cast long, distorted shadows across the icy pavement, but my focus remained locked on the smoking shell of my fourth-floor apartment. The freezing Chicago wind whipped through the thin paramedic blanket draped over my shoulders, biting at my skin, yet the chill barely registered. I had just listened to my own parents dismiss my tragedy as an inconvenience to their sleep schedule. The dial tone from my father's abrupt hang-up still echoed in my ears, a stark confirmation of my absolute abandonment. As the heavy streams of water from the fire hoses finally subdued the last roaring orange flames, leaving behind a black cavernous ruin, a man in a heavy ash-stained turnout coat stepped past the police barricade and walked directly toward me. He did not have the hurried, frantic energy of the first responders battling the blaze. His movements were slow, deliberate, and highly observant. He flashed a metallic badge in his palm and introduced himself as Inspector Ramirez from the Chicago Fire Department Arson Squad. The words Arson Squad hit me with the force of a physical blow. Fires in historic city buildings were unfortunately common, usually the result of faulty, outdated wiring or a forgotten space heater left running in the dead of winter. But the involvement of a specialized arson investigator meant this was not a tragic accident. The atmosphere shifted instantly from a routine emergency response to a criminal investigation. Ramirez gently but firmly guided me away from the chaotic staging area, steering me past the shivering neighbors and the tangled webs of canvas hoses. He led me toward the quiet, insulated shelter of his unmarked command vehicle parked down the block. The heater was blasting inside the dark cabin, but the warmth did nothing to stop the violent shaking in my hands. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic condolences. Instead, he opened a thick leather-bound notebook, clicked his pen, and looked at me with piercing, calculating eyes. He asked me point-blank to list exactly who else possessed a physical key or access code to my specific unit. I blinked momentarily, disoriented by the sudden, intense shift from victim to potential witness. I explained that the building supervisor had a master key, but the only other set belonged to my parents. I had given them a spare set 2 years ago for severe emergencies, though they had never once bothered to visit my home. I added that my sister Sienna and her husband Jamal had unrestricted access to my parents' suburban mansion, including the family safe where that specific spare keyring was kept. I asked the inspector why the access logs mattered so much right now. Ramirez studied my face for a long, silent moment, evaluating my reaction. Then, without a word, He reached into his heavy canvas tactical bag on the passenger seat and pulled out a thick, clear plastic evidence bag. He held it up under the harsh, bright overhead light of the vehicle cabin. Inside the sealed plastic sat a charred, half-melted lump of unrecognizable synthetic material and scorched wires. Even through the thick bagging, I could faintly detect the toxic, sickly sweet chemical odor of a commercial fire accelerant, masking the heavy stench of wet ash. My team found this device tucked behind the baseboards near the primary point of origin in what used to be your living room, Ramirez explained, tapping the plastic surface with the tip of his pen. It is a crudely assembled incendiary device. Someone hooked a digital timer to a small concentrated ignition source and surrounded it with a highly flammable, slow-burning chemical gel. The firing mechanism malfunctioned slightly, creating a delayed spark, which is the only reason this casing did not entirely melt away in the ensuing blaze. Make no mistake, Miss Cassidy, someone intentionally set your apartment on fire tonight. The breath completely evaporated from my lungs. Someone had deliberately tried to burn down my life, my business, and my safety. But the overwhelming question of why was immediately answered when Ramirez shifted the bag, catching the overhead light from a different angle. He instructed me to take a very close look at the melted edge of the plastic casing and asked if there was anyone in my personal circle who might recognize the object fused to it. I leaned forward, squinting through the scratched, ash-covered plastic. Lodged deep within the melted black residue permanently fused to the firing device by the intense thermal heat was a small, heavy piece of metal. It was a solid gold cufflink. The edges of the metal were slightly warped and discolored from the extreme temperatures, but the intricate custom design was completely unmistakable. The surface featured a bold, deeply engraved letter J, surrounded by a distinct geometric Art Deco pattern. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The chaotic world outside the heavy doors of the command vehicle entirely vanished. I knew that cufflink intimately. I knew exactly how much it weighed, how the 18-karat gold caught the light, and exactly how many thousands of dollars it had cost. I had ordered it custom forged from a highly exclusive private jeweler in the Diamond District just last year. It was my extravagant anniversary gift to Jamal, my smooth-talking, fiercely ambitious African-American brother-in-law. Sienna and Jamal had thrown a lavish, catered party at a downtown hotel to celebrate their anniversary. I had spent weeks finding the perfect, sophisticated gift to match Jamal's impeccable, high-end corporate wardrobe. I distinctly remembered handing him the velvet box, watching him admire the heavy gold, and the precise, personalized engraving of his initial before immediately fastening it to his tailored French cuffs. "Are you absolutely certain you recognize this item?" Ramirez asked, his voice low and steady, as he watched all the color completely drain from my face. I nodded slowly, the horrific, suffocating truth settling over my shoulders. I confirmed that I had purchased it myself and that it belonged exclusively to my brother-in-law. Ramirez documented my statement in his notebook, his expression remaining perfectly unreadable. He then asked if my brother-in-law, who had unhindered access to my spare keys, also possessed any specific financial motive to see my property reduced to ashes. The question hung in the warm air of the cabin, thick and damning. Jamal was a high-level, aggressively successful insurance broker. He knew the commercial property insurance industry inside and out. He knew exactly how disastrous claims were processed, how massive payouts were expedited, and precisely how contractual loopholes were exploited by insiders. Most importantly, he knew that my apartment doubled as my secure workspace for my fine art appraisal business. He knew about the multi-million-dollar classical pieces I regularly restored. Suddenly, the horrific phone call with my father made sickening, crystal-clear sense. The absolute lack of parental surprise, the cold, immediate dismissal, the bizarre, highly specific detail my mother threw in about Jamal having an important insurance seminar the next morning and needing his beauty sleep while my life literally went up in flames. They were not just being toxic, apathetic parents. They were actively covering their tracks. They knew the apartment was burning to the ground before I even dialed their number. My family had orchestrated this entire nightmare. They had used their spare key, planted a chemical firebomb in my living room, and left me to deal with the devastating aftermath. They arrogantly assumed the fire would burn hot enough to destroy all the physical evidence, melting everything to untraceable slag. But Jamal had been sloppy and arrogant. He had lost his custom gold cufflink in the rushed darkness to set the timer, and the device had malfunctioned just enough to preserve his catastrophic mistake. I stared at the evidence bag, my initial shock and heartbreak rapidly crystallizing into a cold, diamond-hard fury. They had tried to erase my life, my business, and my independence. They had risked killing me or anyone else sleeping in the building purely for a financial payout. Ramirez broke through my racing thoughts, his tone shifting to a serious, authoritative warning. He explained that if my family was truly involved in an arson of this magnitude, we needed to move with extreme caution. An investigation involving high-value insured property and family members usually uncovered a much deeper, more dangerous financial conspiracy. He explicitly instructed me to remain completely silent about this discovery, and to act as though I knew absolutely nothing about the cause of the fire. I looked up from the gold cufflink and met the inspector's eyes. My hands had completely stopped shaking. The freezing Chicago cold no longer bothered me. A dangerous singular clarity had taken over my mind. I promised the inspector that I would not say a single word to them about the arson investigation. I stepped out of the command vehicle and back into the freezing winter night. I looked at my destroyed home, but I did not feel grief anymore. My parents and my sister thought they could burn me out of their lives and profit from the destruction. They underestimated me, and tomorrow morning I was going straight to their sprawling suburban mansion to look them in the eyes and watch them lie to my face. The morning sun offered zero warmth as I drove my soot-covered sedan through the wrought iron gates of my parents' estate in Lake Forest. The sprawling stone mansion sat at the end of a long, perfectly plowed circular driveway, looking like an impenetrable fortress of wealth. I had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in a 24-hour diner, drinking black coffee and staring at the wall, running the image of Jamal's melted gold cufflink through my mind on a continuous loop. I had not slept. I had not changed my clothes. I still wore the same jeans and heavy winter coat from the night before, and every time I moved, the pungent, inescapable stench of wet ash and toxic smoke rolled off the fabric. My objective was simple and strictly logistical. I needed to access the primary family safe located in my father's ground floor study. Years ago, before our relationship had completely frozen over, my father had insisted all family members keep their vital emergency documents in his climate-controlled fireproof vault. My birth certificate, my passport, and a heavily encrypted backup hard drive containing the digital appraisals for my entire fine art inventory were locked inside. I needed those documents to begin the legal process of proving my losses. I also needed to see my family face to face, fully armed with the secret Inspector Ramirez had uncovered, to see exactly how they would play their hands. I bypassed the grand front doors and let myself in through the side entrance, punching the security code into the keypad. The heavy oak door clicked open, welcoming me into a suffocatingly quiet mudroom that smelled of expensive floral diffusers and lemon polish. The contrast between my ruined, ash-soaked reality and their immaculate temperature-controlled bubble was nauseating. As I stepped onto the polished marble floors of the main hallway, the smell of my ruined apartment seemed to amplify, becoming a harsh, violent odor invading their pristine sanctuary. I intended to walk straight to the study, grab my documents, and leave before anyone could confront me. But as I passed the arched entryway of the formal dining room, the sound of clinking crystal and light, easy laughter stopped me dead in my tracks. I turned and looked into the cavernous room. The morning light poured through the massive bay windows, illuminating a lavish, catered-style breakfast spread across the long mahogany table. There were silver domes of eggs, Benedict platters of fresh exotic fruits, a tower of artisanal pastries, and crystal pitchers filled with freshly squeezed orange juice. Sitting at the head of the table, looking incredibly rested and entirely unbothered, were my sister Sienna and her husband Jamal. Jamal wore a crisp, long-sleeved button-down shirt, looking every inch the successful insurance broker preparing for a high-stakes seminar. Sienna was lounging in a silk designer robe, her hair perfectly blown out, sipping a mimosa. They were the picture of carefree suburban royalty. There was absolutely no tension in their posture, no frantic worry for my safety, no residual guilt hanging over their morning meal. They had orchestrated the destruction of my life mere hours ago, and they were celebrating with breakfast pastries. I stepped into the dining room. The heavy soles of my boots echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. Sienna froze with her crystal glass halfway to her mouth. Jamal stopped chewing, his eyes darting toward me with a flash of something unreadable before immediately settling into a mask of mild, irritated surprise. "Oh my God!" Cassidy, Sienna gasped, though her tone lacked any actual shock. She dramatically pinched her nose, recoiling in her tufted dining chair. "You smell absolutely revolting. It is like you rolled around in a campfire. Could you not have showered before tracking that stench into the house?" I stood at the opposite end of the table, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my ash-stained coat. I looked directly at Jamal, watching his jaw muscles flex as he swallowed his food. "I survived a massive structural fire a few hours ago," I stated, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "My apartment burned to the foundation. I do not exactly have a working shower right now, Sienna." Jamal picked up a linen napkin and casually dabbed the corners of his mouth. "It is a terrible tragedy, Cassidy," he said, his smooth, resonant voice dripping with false corporate sympathy. "Your father told us the news when we woke up. We are just so relieved you made it out safely. Truly, it is a blessing." The sheer audacity of his performance was breathtaking. He was looking right into the eyes of the woman he had tried to ruin, offering textbook condolences while knowing exactly what he had done. I dug my fingernails into my palms inside my coat pockets, anchoring myself to the memory of his engraved cufflink sitting in an evidence bag downtown. Sienna set her mimosa down with a sharp clink, her sympathetic facade vanishing as quickly as it appeared. She leaned forward, crossing her arms over her silk robe. "Let us cut the fake pity routine," she said, her voice dropping into a vicious, condescending sneer. "We all know exactly what is going on here, Cassidy. You are not fooling anyone." I tilted my head, maintaining my silent, unblinking stare. "What exactly am I doing, Sienna?" She scoffed, rolling her eyes as if my presence was an insult to her intelligence. "Dad told us your independent art restoration business has been struggling for months. You took on a massive lease for that city apartment, you constantly buy expensive materials, and you refuse to ask for help because of your ridiculous pride. And now, magically, right when you are supposedly drowning in debt, your entire workspace goes up in flames." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by the angle she was taking. She was not just denying involvement. She was actively rewriting the narrative to frame me. Sienna stood up, walking around the table to stand a few feet away from me, her face twisted with haughty disgust. "You burned it down yourself, did you not?" she accused, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "You torched your own failing business to cash in on a fraudulent insurance policy. It is pathetic, Cassidy. It is absolutely pathetic. You are so desperate to prove you can survive without Dad's money that you resorted to criminal arson." Jamal remained seated, swirling the orange juice in his glass, letting his wife do the heavy lifting. He did not contradict her. He let her hurl the very crime they had committed directly onto my shoulders. The psychological projection was masterful, a calculated offensive strike designed to put me on the defensive, to make me doubt myself, and to ensure I would never dare point a finger at them. "Do not even think about begging us for a bailout," Sienna continued, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "If you think you can use this little disaster to guilt Mom and Dad into writing you a massive check to start over, you are out of your mind. We are not paying for your criminal mistakes. You made your bed, Cassidy. Now you can sleep in the ashes. We are protecting the family assets from your absolute mess." She crossed her arms, waiting for my reaction. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to deny it, to cry, to break down and defend my honor. She wanted the hysterical, messy reaction of a desperate victim so she could validate her own narrative and dismiss me entirely. But I did not give her what she wanted. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply absorbed the weight of their staggering hypocrisy, filing every vicious word away in my mind while maintaining a perfect, unreadable stillness. The silence in the grand dining room stretched out heavy and suffocating. Sienna was breathing hard, a triumphant flush coloring her cheeks after delivering her venomous speech. She waited for me to explode. She wanted the validation of my screaming, the chaotic proof of my supposed guilt and desperation. She wanted me to beg, to cry, to frantically defend my innocence against her baseless accusations of insurance fraud. But the screaming never came. The white-hot fury that had been building inside my chest suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. A profound, hyper-observant stillness washed over my mind. It was the exact same clinical detachment I used when examining a heavily damaged piece of fine art under a magnifying glass, looking for hidden fractures and microscopic flaws beneath the surface of the canvas. I let my eyes sweep over the two of them, processing every minute detail of their morning tableau. Jamal sat back in his heavy wooden chair, a picture of relaxed confidence. He let out a soft, dismissive sigh as if dealing with my ruined life was merely a tedious chore on his daily itinerary. He reached across the crisp linen tablecloth to grab his crystal orange juice glass. As his arm extended, the perfectly tailored French cuff of his expensive dress shirt rode up just a fraction of an inch. It was a tiny movement, a fleeting exposure of skin, but my professionally trained eyes caught it instantly. Right there, on the sensitive flesh of his inner wrist, was a fresh, angry red blister. The skin around it was inflamed, raw, and slightly blistering, the unmistakable signature of a severe localized burn. It was not a cooking accident or a casual scrape. It was a searing thermal kiss, the exact kind of specific injury you would sustain if your hand lingered a second too long near a malfunctioning, slow-burning chemical incendiary device. The custom gold cufflink I had bought him was sitting in an evidence bag downtown, but the physical branding of his crime was staring me right in the face. My gaze smoothly flicked back to Sienna. She misinterpreted my unblinking silence as total defeat. A smug, victorious smile spread across her lips as she adjusted the collar of her silk designer robe, a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. As her hand brushed against her chest, my eyes locked onto the piece of jewelry resting against her collarbone. The air completely vanished from my lungs. Hanging from a delicate vintage gold chain was an antique teardrop emerald pendant surrounded by tiny Victorian-cut diamonds. It was a breathtaking, entirely unique piece of heirloom jewelry. It was my necklace, eh? My mind raced back to the previous evening. Before I left my apartment to grab a quick dinner, I had taken that exact emerald necklace off and laid it carefully on the velvet tray of my bedroom vanity dresser. That wooden dresser was located on the fourth floor of a building that had just been subjected to thousands of degrees of sustained thermal heat for hours. By all known laws of physics, that delicate gold chain should be a puddle of liquid metal buried in the wet ashes, and the emerald should be cracked and blackened beyond recognition. Yet here it was perfectly pristine, resting against my sister's skin in the morning light. The sheer horrifying gravity of what I was looking at slammed into my chest with sickening force. They had not just set my apartment on fire, they had robbed me first. They had let themselves into my home with my parents' spare key, meticulously packed up my most valuable personal belongings, my jewelry, my family heirlooms, anything of concentrated worth that they could easily carry, and then splashed chemical accelerant across my walls to cover their tracks. They ruthlessly plundered my life before destroying the evidence. Sienna was sitting there, literally wearing my stolen jewelry, lecturing me about financial responsibility and criminal mistakes. The absolute sociopathy of it was staggering. They were so drunk on their own perceived brilliance, so entirely convinced of my pathetic stupidity, that they did not even bother to hide the evidence of their theft. They thought I was too broken and overwhelmed by the fire to notice an emerald necklace. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to lunge across the mahogany table. I wanted to rip the stolen necklace from her throat, grab Jamal by his burned wrist, and demand a confession right there in the dining room. But the cold, calculating part of my brain clamped down hard on those violent impulses. Inspector Ramirez's warning echoed loudly in my ears. If I reacted now, if I showed them even a fraction of a hint that I knew what they had done, I would lose my only advantage. They would panic, destroy the stolen goods, and use Jamal's extensive insurance connections to bury the evidence and tie me up in legal red tape forever. I had to let them believe their flawless performance was working. I had to let them think I was exactly the pathetic defeated victim they wanted me to be. I swallowed the bitter bile rising in my throat and forced my shoulders to slump forward. I let my eyes drop to the hardwood floor, perfectly mimicking the posture of a thoroughly beaten woman. I let a long, ragged breath escape my lips, channeling every ounce of genuine physical exhaustion I felt from standing in the freezing snow into a display of absolute surrender. I let my hands tremble slightly at my sides. "You are right," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly small and hollow. "I am sorry I disturbed your morning. I just came to get my emergency backup drive from Dad's safe so I can start dealing with the bank. I will not bother you again." Sienna let out a sharp, highly satisfied laugh, tossing her perfect hair over her shoulder. "Make it quick, Cassidy. The smell of your clothes is honestly making me nauseous." Jamal finally spoke, his voice returning to that smooth, sickeningly fake sympathy. "Let me know if you need help navigating the claims adjusters, Cass. It can be a very complicated process for amateurs. I am happy to point you in the right direction." I nodded mutely, keeping my eyes averted so they could not see the lethal calculating promise burning in them. I turned my back on their lavish breakfast, walking slowly and heavily toward the hallway that led to my father's study. I kept my head down, playing the part of the tragic failure perfectly. They genuinely thought they had successfully burned my life to the ground and stolen my future. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the match. Before my hand could even graze the brass handle of the study door, it swung open from the inside. My father Thomas filled the doorway, his tall frame clad in a pristine, tailored suit that made my ash-covered clothes feel even more intrusive. His face was a mask of rigid executive displeasure. He did not reach out to hug me. He did not ask about my injuries. Instead, he gripped my elbow with a vice-like hold, turning me sharply around and marching me straight back into the dining room where Sienna and Jamal were waiting. My father did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. He strode to the head of the mahogany table and slammed a thick, cream-colored legal portfolio down right next to Sienna's half-empty mimosa glass. The heavy thud echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table, fixing me with a glare that felt more appropriate for a hostile corporate takeover than a family reunion. "Sit down and read this," Thomas ordered, tapping the leather-bound folder with his index finger. "We do not have time for your emotional theatrics today, Cassidy. Your sheer carelessness last night has put this entire family in a highly compromised position, and I am stepping in to mitigate the damage." I stood frozen at the edge of the Persian rug, keeping my eyes wide and vacant, perfectly playing the role of a traumatized victim. "What damage are you talking about?" I asked, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound pathetic. "My whole life just burned to the ground." "Exactly." My father snapped, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of empathy. "You have lost your apartment, your workspace, and your entire inventory of antique art. You are going to be facing massive liabilities. The building management will sue you for negligence. Your clients will sue you for their destroyed pieces. By the end of the week, you will be completely bankrupt. Your creditors are going to circle like vultures, Cassidy, and they will absolutely come after your assets." He flipped the portfolio open, revealing a densely typed legal contract flagged with bright yellow signature tabs. "That is why you are signing this document right now," he demanded. I forced my gaze down to the bold, capitalized print at the top of the page. It was a formal, irrevocable relinquishment of rights. He was demanding that I sign over my position as the primary beneficiary of my late grandfather's $5 million trust fund. The trust was legally structured to vest completely on my 30th birthday, which was exactly 6 months away. My grandfather had explicitly left that money to me because he knew my parents would squander it. Now Thomas was demanding I hand it directly to his golden child. "I cannot let your massive financial failures drag down the family wealth," Thomas stated, his tone dripping with self-righteous authority. If you hold on to your beneficiary status, the courts and your creditors will seize that $5 million the absolute second it hits your bank account. To protect the family legacy, you must transfer your legal rights entirely to Sienna. She will hold the assets securely. Sienna smiled warmly, reaching out to trace the edge of her stolen emerald pendant. It is for your own good, Cass, she purred, her voice laced with poisonous sweetness. We are protecting you from yourself. You clearly cannot handle money or property without burning it to ashes. Just sign it over to me and we will make sure you get a tiny allowance to help you find a little studio apartment somewhere safe. Jamal nodded solemnly, crossing his arms and putting on a grave professional face. It is standard asset protection, Cassidy. As an insurance broker, I see this all the time. Total liability liquidation. If you do not sign this right now, you will lose the grandfather trust to the state anyway. Your father is giving you the smartest financial advice possible. The synchronized precision of their ambush was breathtaking. It was a flawless, predatory strike. They had burned my apartment to destroy my life, stolen my most valuable jewelry, and now they were using the very crisis they manufactured to extort a $5 million fortune out of my hands. If I signed that paper, I would walk away with absolutely nothing and they would be infinitely richer. I needed to get out of that room before my absolute disgust shattered my carefully constructed facade. I took a sudden staggering step backward, bringing a trembling hand up to my forehead. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, mimicking the onset of a severe panic attack. I let my knees buckle just a fraction, grasping the edge of a dining chair for support. I cannot, I gasped, coughing roughly to remind them of the smoke inhalation I had supposedly suffered. I cannot read legal jargon right now. My head is pounding. Everything is spinning. I cannot breathe in here. Stop stalling and sign the paper, Cassidy, my father barked, stepping toward me with a pen extended. I shook my head wildly, backing away toward the mudroom doors. I just need fresh air, I stammered, wrapping my arms around my chest. I need to clear my head. I will look at it later, I promise. I just need to sit in my car for a minute. Before any of them could grab my arm, I pushed backward through the heavy wooden door, stumbling out into the freezing winter morning. The icy wind hit my face like a physical slap, but the cold was exactly what I needed. I power-walked down the paved driveway until I reached my soot-covered sedan parked near the iron gates. I ripped the door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the locks down. The moment the doors locked, my hyperventilating stopped entirely. My posture straightened. The pathetic, shaking victim vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating professional. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone, intending to call Inspector Ramirez and update him on the stolen emerald necklace. Before I could dial the number, the screen lit up with a high-priority push notification. It was an automated email alert sent to my business account. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the corporate logo at the header. It was from the exact high-end commercial insurance firm where Jamal worked as a senior broker. Because my business email was linked as the primary contact on the policy file, the automated system had blind copied me on a closed internal routing receipt. I read the text of the email, and the final horrifying piece of my family's conspiracy clicked perfectly into place. The automated message confirmed that a highly expedited top-tier commercial claim had just been approved. The claim was for exactly $2 million, listed under complete loss of destroyed fine art inventory from my address. Jamal had not just set the fire, he had used his senior broker credentials to completely bypass the standard visual appraisals, dodge the fire investigation protocols, and forcefully push through a massive $2 million fraudulent payout in record time. But the most damning evidence was printed at the very bottom of the receipt. The $2 million was not routed to my business checking account to help me rebuild. Jamal had altered the policy paperwork. The automated alert confirmed that the entire $2 million sum was currently being routed directly into a joint beneficiary account. The name listed on the routing destination was Thomas. I sat in the freezing silence of my car, staring at the bright screen of my phone. The sheer scale of their betrayal was almost incomprehensible. My father had just stood in his dining room demanding I hand over my $5 million trust fund because I was supposedly bankrupt. Meanwhile, he was actively receiving a stolen $2 million insurance payout for the art his son-in-law had just burned. They were attempting to strip mine my entire existence from every possible angle. They had crossed a line of federal wire fraud and grand larceny that they could never return from, and I possessed the digital paper trail to prove it. I put my car in drive tires, crunching against the snow, steering away from the estate, and heading straight toward the only place where I could confirm the final trap they had laid for themselves. The drive from the pristine, snow-dusted avenues of Lake Forest to the bleak industrial sprawl of the western suburbs took just over an hour. The gray winter sky hung low and heavy over the highway, perfectly matching the stark concrete landscape rolling past my windows. I navigated the salt-stained roads with mechanical precision, my mind operating with a lethal clarity that left no room for shock or grief. My father and my brother-in-law had played a high-stakes game of chess, assuming I was nothing more than a pawn they could sacrifice to inflate their own bank accounts. They were about to discover they had drastically miscalculated the board. I pulled my soot-stained sedan into the empty parking lot of a massive windowless concrete bunker. There were no prominent signs, no welcoming glass facades, and absolutely no indication of the staggering wealth hidden within its walls. It looked like an abandoned data center or an anonymous logistics warehouse. In reality, it was a highly secure, climate-controlled private art vault utilized exclusively by top-tier galleries, anonymous private collectors, and elite restoration experts. I walked through the reinforced steel entrance and stepped into the sterile, brightly lit reception area. The armed security guard behind the ballistic glass counter did not blink at my disheveled appearance or the overwhelming scent of wet ash clinging to my winter coat. In this facility, absolute discretion was the only currency that mattered. I handed over my heavy metallic keycard and placed my right hand flat against the biometric scanner. The machine chirped a sharp tone of approval, verifying my identity, and the heavy interlocking doors hissed open, granting me access to the subterranean levels. The contrast between the chaotic, smoking ruins of my fourth-floor apartment and the silent, immaculate corridors of the vault was jarring. The air down here was artificially purified, constantly filtered, and rigidly maintained at exactly 68 degrees with precisely 50% humidity. I walked past rows of identical brushed steel doors, my boots making no sound on the specialized anti-static flooring, until I reached Unit 408. I inserted my physical key, punched my secondary access code into the digital keypad, and hauled the heavy steel door open. I reached out and flicked the switch for the overhead daylight-balanced LED panels. The room flooded with crisp white light, illuminating the metal storage racks and padded restoration tables, taking up the center of the unit. There they were, resting perfectly safe, entirely untouched, and completely oblivious to the fiery destruction that had occurred hours prior, sat the actual multi-million-dollar masterpieces I had been contracted to appraise and restore. 3 breathtaking Renaissance-era oil canvases, 2 intricate Baroque bronze sculptures, and a fragile collection of 17th-century Dutch miniatures were securely wrapped in archival-grade glassine and custom-built protective crates. The sheer monetary value sitting in this single 10 by 10 concrete room easily exceeded $2 million. I stood in the doorway staring at the pristine artifacts, and a slow, genuine smile finally spread across my face. My family thought they were so incredibly intelligent. Jamal, with his aggressive corporate ambition and insider knowledge of the insurance industry, thought he had orchestrated the perfect, untraceable crime. He knew my apartment doubled as my workspace. He knew I was currently evaluating a portfolio of extremely valuable classical pieces for a prominent downtown estate. What he did not know, because he was an arrogant amateur who had never bothered to understand the actual mechanics of my profession, was that no legitimate certified art appraiser would ever keep highly volatile, multi-million-dollar uninsured inventory in a residential fourth-floor walk-up next to a standard galley kitchen. That would be professional suicide. The pieces that had been sitting in my living room, the ones Jamal had callously soaked in chemical accelerant and blown to pieces, were nothing but high-tech, utterly worthless synthetic replicas. I routinely commissioned dimensional polymer prints of the original canvases to use for preliminary lighting tests, spatial staging, and chemical reference mapping. They looked absolutely flawless to the naked eye, capturing every brushstroke and color gradient of the originals, but chemically, they were just cheap synthetic plastics and sprayed ink. When Jamal planted that crude incendiary device behind my baseboards, he fully believed he was incinerating $2 million of insured historical canvas. He assumed the resulting pile of toxic black ash would be all the proof the insurance company needed to process a catastrophic loss. Normally, a commercial claim of that staggering magnitude would trigger an immediate, exhaustive forensic investigation. Specialized insurance adjusters would swarm the wreckage, sifting through the debris with microscopes to test for trace antique pigments, specific historical canvas weaves, and radioactive dating markers. They would have discovered within hours that the ashes belonged to cheap modern plastics, not 17th century oil paint. The claim would have been instantly flagged for fraud and summarily denied. But Jamal had not let the normal protocols play out. He had used his senior broker credentials to completely bypass the visual appraisals. He had logged into his firm's internal system, overridden the mandatory forensic inspection phases, verified the loss of the classical art himself, and forcefully fast-tracked the $2 million payout before the fire department had even finished rolling up their canvas hoses. He expedited the entire process under the guise of an emergency corporate payout to save a struggling client. He was so eager to secure the money and cover his tracks that he never stopped to verify if the actual art had burned. He rushed the funds straight through the corporate pipeline and routed the entire $2 million directly into my father's joint beneficiary account. I stepped fully into the vault and let the heavy steel door click shut behind me, sealing myself in the quiet, secure room. The trap had been sprung flawlessly, but not the one my family had intended for me. They had dug their own grave with breathtaking efficiency. This was no longer a simple case of residential arson or petty family theft. By actively using his corporate credentials to bypass an official investigation, fabricating a total loss report, and authorizing a massive electronic transfer of funds across state banking lines for assets that currently sat perfectly safe in a concrete bunker, Jamal had crossed a catastrophic legal threshold. And by willingly receiving those illicit funds to hide them from my supposed creditors, my father Thomas had made himself a direct complicit accessory. They had not just stolen from me, they had successfully committed textbook undeniable federal insurance fraud and corporate embezzlement. They had triggered federal statutes crossing lines governed by the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. There would be no quiet family cover-up. There would be no private settlements or swept-under-the-rug embarrassments. They had locked themselves into a federal crime carrying decades of mandatory prison time, and I held the only key. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening the digital file containing Jamal's automated routing receipt, ready to make the phone call that would shatter their pristine Lake Forest lives forever. My thumb hovered over the glowing green call icon on my phone screen, fully prepared to dial Inspector Ramirez and detonate the explosive digital evidence I had just uncovered. But before my screen could transition to the dialing interface, the phone erupted in a harsh, violently vibrating ring. The sudden noise was deafening inside the stark, acoustically sealed concrete walls of the art vault, bouncing sharply off the brushed steel doors and metal storage racks. I glanced at the caller ID flashing brightly against the dim background. It was Jamal. I paused, letting the phone ring for 3 long seconds. He must have realized I was gone and decided to pursue me before I could collect my thoughts. I swiped right to accept the call and lifted the device to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. I let the heavy dead air of the vault stretch across the cellular connection, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a greeting. Cassidy. The single word sliced through the silence of the line. Gone was the smooth, performative sympathy he had plastered on over breakfast. Gone was the condescending, brotherly concern he used when Sienna was in the room. The voice resonating through the receiver was entirely stripped of its suburban polish. It was cold, metallic, and ruthlessly calculating. It was the voice of a predator, the tone of a man accustomed to crushing opposition in high-stakes corporate boardrooms without leaving a single fingerprint behind. "You running out of the house this morning was a mistake," Jamal stated, his tone flat and unequivocally authoritative. "Your father and Sienna are currently under the impression that you fled to throw a childish tantrum about signing over the trust fund. I, however, am a pragmatist. I do not like loose ends, and your erratic behavior is becoming a significant liability to this family." I kept my breathing slow and measured, staring at a 17th-century Dutch miniature wrapped securely in its protective archival crate right in front of me. "I am not a liability, Jamal," I replied, keeping my voice carefully subdued, playing into his expectation of my weakness. "I am just trying to survive the week. And I am going to tell you exactly how you are going to survive it," he shot back seamlessly, stepping right over my words. "You are going to drive your car straight to the Chicago Fire Department headquarters. You are going to walk inside, request an immediate interview with whatever arson investigator caught your case, and you are going to sign a sworn, legally binding affidavit. You will tell them that you were burning a large decorative candle in your living room last night, that you irresponsibly fell asleep, and that the fire was a tragic, negligent accident caused entirely by your own stupidity." The sheer brazenness of the demand sent a shockwave of pure adrenaline straight to my fingertips. He wanted me to legally perjure myself. He wanted me to hand the authorities a signed confession that would cleanly shut down any ongoing arson investigation, permanently sealing the lid on his crime. He needed the official fire department file closed and categorized as accidental, so the corporate underwriters would not have a single reason to scrutinize his highly irregular, fast-tracked $2 million payout to my father. "I cannot do that," I whispered, injecting a note of manufactured panic into my voice. "If I sign a statement taking the blame for destroying the entire building, the landlord's insurance company will come after me for millions. I will be ruined." Jamal let out a sharp, humorless exhale. "You are already ruined, Cassidy, but you have absolutely no idea how much worse I can make it for you. Do you honestly think my influence stops at commercial property claims? I work at the apex of the financial sector. I know exactly how your independent appraisal business operates. I know the exact banking institutions you use to float your material costs and manage your client escrow accounts." He did not raise his voice. He simply let the malicious, crushing weight of his words settle over the line. "If you do not sign that affidavit by the end of business hours today, I will personally red flag your entire financial profile across every major banking network. I will trigger automated fraud alerts on your social security number. By tomorrow morning, every single one of your personal credit cards will be frozen. Your business accounts will be locked under suspicious activity protocols, and you will not be able to withdraw a single dime to buy yourself a cup of coffee, let alone hire a lawyer or rebuild your life." I remained completely silent, letting him reveal the absolute depths of his cruelty. "And that is just the banking side," Jamal continued, his voice dripping with venomous confidence. "The fine art appraisal world is tiny, Cassidy. It runs entirely on pristine reputations and absolute trust. All it takes is one senior insurance broker like myself flagging you in the central underwriting database as a high-risk liability. If I flag your professional profile, no insurer will ever cover a piece of art you touch. No prestigious gallery will hire you. No private collector will let you step foot in their home. I will have you blacklisted and professionally excommunicated before the weekend. Your career will be dead and buried right alongside your apartment." I stood in the center of the vault, bathed in the crisp white LED light. The physical chill of the room was nothing compared to the absolute ice in his voice. He was threatening me with total annihilation. He genuinely believed he held all the power that he could casually snap his fingers and erase my existence to protect his stolen millions. He thought he was boxing in a desperate, defenseless woman. He did not know I was standing mere inches away from the actual undamaged art he thought he had burned. He did not know I was looking at the digital receipt of his federal wire fraud on my screen. "Do you understand me, Cassidy?" Jamal demanded, the sharp edge of impatience finally bleeding through his corporate armor. You go to the fire department, you sign the paper, you take the fall, or I will ensure you spend the rest of your life crawling in the gutter. You have until 5 o'clock. I looked at the crates of priceless art. I thought about the gold cufflink sitting in the evidence bag. The fear he expected to instill in me was entirely absent. Instead, a dangerous, absolute calm settled deep into my bones. The rules of engagement were officially set. "I hear you, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping the facade of panic, entirely becoming as cold and steady as the concrete beneath my feet, loud and clear. Before he could utter another threat or question the sudden shift in my tone, I pulled the phone away from my ear and abruptly terminated the call. The screen went black, and the heavy, insulated silence of the vault rushed back in to surround me. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the undeniable reality of what was about to happen. My family had just drawn their final line in the sand, betting their entire empire on my submission. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, the metallic casing freezing against my skin. They wanted a war of mutual destruction, and they were about to learn exactly what happens when you hand the matches to the person you tried to burn. I placed my phone face down on the stainless steel restoration table and reached into the heavy canvas work tote I had carried inside. I pulled out my laptop, the sleek metal casing freezing against my palms, and flipped open the screen. The harsh fluorescent light of the vault reflected off the monitor as I immediately bypassed my standard operating system and launched a highly encrypted, multi-routed virtual private network. Jamal and Sienna believed I was an arrogant amateur who left millions of dollars of unprotected assets in a standard residential unit. They vastly underestimated my professional paranoia. My insurance policies mandated strict security measures, and while the building had standard hallway cameras, I required absolute internal surveillance. Tucked discreetly inside the intake vent of a high-capacity air purifier in my living room was an independent battery-operated micro-lens security camera. It ran on a separate cellular network entirely disconnected from the apartment's main router and triggered off motion to upload high-definition video directly to a private offshore cloud server located in Zurich. It was designed specifically to survive power cuts, signal jamming, and physical tampering. I logged into the offshore client portal, my fingers flying across the keyboard to input the 24-character alphanumeric passcode. The dashboard loaded, displaying a single massive video file recorded between 1 and 3 in the morning. I hit download. The progress bar appeared on the screen but immediately stalled. The thick, reinforced concrete walls and heavy steel rebar of the subterranean art vault were severely throttling the cellular relay. The estimated time remaining flashed across the screen, calculating a painfully slow crawl. 10%. I leaned heavily against the metal table, listening to the low, mechanical hum of the climate control system. My pulse thudded in my ears. 15%. I thought about Jamal sitting in his luxury car, confidently threatening to financially suffocate me and blacklist my entire career. 22%. I thought about my father throwing that trust fund relinquishment contract onto the mahogany dining table, pretending to save the family from my fictional bankruptcy while actively receiving the stolen insurance payout. 40%. The wait was excruciating, stretching the seconds into hours. I stared at the blue bar inching across the monitor, willing it to move faster. 65%. My entire future hinged on the integrity of this single digital file. If the thermal heat had melted the camera housing before the upload finished, or if the thick chemical smoke had completely obscured the lens, I would be walking into a federal war armed with nothing but a damaged cufflink and a lot of circumstantial accusations. 89%. I held my breath, my hands gripping the edge of the metal table so hard my knuckles turned white. 99%. 100%. The file crystallized on my desktop. I did not hesitate. I double-clicked the icon and expanded the media player to full screen. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before snapping into crystal-clear, high-definition night vision. The familiar layout of my living room was bathed in a stark, glowing green-gray tint. The timestamp in the bottom right corner read 1:14 in the morning. For the first 30 seconds, the frame was perfectly still. Then the heavy brass deadbolt on my front door clicked open. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, and no picked locks. The door swung inward smoothly, and two figures stepped over the threshold. Sienna and Jamal. They were not wearing masks. They were not attempting to conceal their identities in the dark. They moved with the arrogant, unhurried confidence of people walking into their own home, casually utilizing the spare emergency key I had entrusted to my parents 2 years ago. The night vision lens captured every single detail with unforgiving clarity. Sienna marched directly past the replica canvases and disappeared down the hallway toward my bedroom. She re-emerged less than a minute later, carrying the heavy velvet jewelry tray from my vanity. I watched in cold, silent horror as my own sister aggressively began snatching up my grandmother's rings, my diamond earrings, and the antique teardrop emerald pendant, carelessly stuffing them into a massive leather designer tote bag. She moved with a frenzied, entitled greed, ransacking my most personal possessions without a single ounce of hesitation. While Sienna looted my bedroom, Jamal went to work in the living room. He pulled a heavy plastic jug and a small digital firing mechanism from his duffel bag. The camera caught the sharp, focused expression on his face as he unscrewed the cap. I watched him splash the thick chemical accelerant in wide, sweeping arcs across the baseboards, deliberately soaking the floorboards directly beneath the replica Renaissance canvases. He was methodical, ensuring the fire would consume the fake art first and burn hot enough to mask the chemical signature. Jamal crouched near the wall to attach the firing timer, his back temporarily to the lens. Sienna finished shoving the last of my valuables into her bag and hoisted it onto her shoulder. She walked back into the center of the living room, stopping mere inches from the air purifier. She stood directly in the center of the frame, the green tint illuminating the sharp, cruel lines of her face. She looked straight ahead, her gaze unknowingly piercing directly through the hidden microlens. A wide, genuinely delighted smile broke across her face. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that the sensitive microphone picked up with terrifying clarity. "Dad was right," Sienna laughed, watching her husband wire the explosive device. "Burn it all. She won't let go of the trust fund otherwise." The video feed abruptly cut to black as the incendiary device detonated, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark monitor. The absolute confirmation washed over me like ice water. It was not just my sister and her husband acting out of rogue greed. My father had given the order. He had orchestrated the destruction of my home, mandated the theft of my property, and facilitated the insurance fraud, all to force my hand on a $5 million inheritance. They were all in on it together, a complete united family conspiracy designed to break me. I closed the laptop, a profound, unshakable calm settling over my mind. They wanted to play a ruthless game to secure their legacy, but they had just handed me the ultimate weapon to dismantle it entirely. The drive from the subterranean art vault to the Chicago Police Department's central headquarters was a blur of gray asphalt and shifting traffic lights, but my focus remained absolute. The terrified, hyperventilating woman who had stumbled out of the Lake Forest estate hours ago was dead. In her place was a woman forged from the very ashes her family had created. I secured my laptop in my heavy canvas work tote alongside the plastic evidence bag containing my father's gold cufflink. The winter air felt different as I parked my soot-stained sedan and walked toward the precinct. It was no longer biting or oppressive. It was bracing, fueling the cold, calculated momentum driving me forward. The precinct was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and distressed civilians crowding the front reporting desk. I did not take a numbered ticket. I did not sit in the rigid plastic waiting chairs. I bypassed the disorganized line entirely, walking straight up to the elevated desk of the duty sergeant. When he gruffly told me to step back behind the yellow line, I did not flinch. I placed my driver's license on the scratched laminate counter and kept my voice pitched at a steady, authoritative volume. "I am here to see Inspector Ramirez regarding a residential arson," I stated clearly. "And you need to contact the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I am reporting an active multi-million-dollar interstate wire fraud and corporate extortion conspiracy. Tell Ramirez the victim from the fourth-floor walk-up is ready to talk. The sergeant blinked visibly, taken aback by the clinical precision of my demand. He picked up his desk phone, and within 10 minutes I was escorted away from the noisy, bustling bullpen. I was placed inside a sterile, windowless interrogation room deep within the detective's bureau. The space was aggressively bleak, featuring a scratched metal table, 3 rigid metal chairs, and a large pane of one-way mirrored glass. I sat perfectly still in the center chair. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across my ruined coat. I did not fidget. I did not wring my hands. The instinct to cry to mourn the profound betrayal of my own blood had been entirely excised from my system. I felt nothing but a hollow Arctic calm. I was a surgeon preparing to operate. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inspector Ramirez stepped into the room holding a cardboard folder and looking significantly more alert than during our brief encounter early that morning. Behind him walked a tall, sharply dressed man with a severe posture and an impeccably tailored dark suit. Ramirez closed the door and took the seat opposite me. "Cassidy," he began, his tone a mix of professional caution and genuine curiosity. "You made quite an entrance out there. This is Special Agent Vance, FBI Financial Crimes Division. He happened to be in the building consulting on a separate task force, but your specific mention of interstate wire fraud caught his attention." Vance gave a curt nod, pulling a fresh notepad from his jacket pocket. "I understand your apartment burned down last night, Miss Wilson," Vance said, his voice smooth and probing. "And I am sorry for your loss. But deploying terms like federal extortion and wire fraud is a serious escalation. What exactly are you reporting?" I did not offer a polite preamble. I unzipped my canvas tote and placed the transparent plastic evidence bag in the exact center of the metal table. Inside, the heavy gold cufflink gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. "I found this under my intact sofa cushion at 3 in the morning, right before the fire ignited," I stated, my voice devoid of a single emotional tremor. "It belongs to my father, Thomas. It is custom monogrammed. He was not in my apartment last night, but his son-in-law Jamal was." Before either man could ask a follow-up question, I pulled my laptop from the tote, opened it, and spun the screen to face them. I hit play. The high-definition night vision footage from my Zurich-backed cloud server filled the monitor. Ramirez and Vance leaned forward instinctively. They watched in absolute silence as the heavy brass deadbolt clicked open and Sienna and Jamal stepped into the frame. The audio was flawless. They watched my sister eagerly ransack my bedroom, shoving my antique jewelry and stolen emeralds into her designer bag. They watched Jamal meticulously splash chemical accelerant across the baseboards beneath the art staging area. Then Sienna stepped into the center of the frame, looking directly toward the hidden microlens. Her cruel, delighted laugh echoed off the cinderblock walls of the interrogation room. "Dad was right, burn it all. She won't let go of the trust fund otherwise." I paused the video right on Sienna's smiling face. The heavy silence in the interrogation room was deafening. Ramirez stared at the frozen image, his jaw slightly slack. Agent Vance had stopped writing entirely, his pen hovering motionlessly over his notepad. "They intended to destroy what they believed was $2 million in insured historical art," I explained, maintaining my flawless poker face. I placed a thick stack of printed appraisal documents next to the laptop. However, the pieces they burned were synthetic polymer replicas. The genuine artifacts are currently secured in an underground climate-controlled art vault. My brother-in-law is a senior commercial broker at a high-end insurance firm. He did not know the art was fake. I slid the final piece of paper across the table, tapping my index finger against the corporate logo at the top. "This is a blind-copied internal routing receipt generated by his firm's automated system less than 2 hours ago. Jamal intentionally bypassed all mandatory forensic fire investigations. He used his executive credentials to fabricate a total loss report and forcefully fast-tracked a $2 million fraudulent payout." I pointed to the routing destination at the bottom of the page. "He bypassed my business accounts entirely. The stolen funds were wired directly into a joint beneficiary account controlled by my father." I sat back, folding my hands neatly in my lap. My father is currently using the threat of my manufactured bankruptcy and the destruction of my livelihood to extort me into signing away my rights to a $5 million trust fund. Meanwhile, he is actively receiving the proceeds of a fabricated commercial insurance claim across state banking lines. I looked directly into Agent Vance's eyes. I believe that falls under your jurisdiction, Agent. The two seasoned investigators sat completely immobilized by the sheer precision and cold execution of my report. I had not come to them seeking comfort, and I had not come asking for a standard investigation. I had walked into their precinct and methodically handed them a fully wrapped, indisputable federal indictment on a silver platter. Agent Vance was the first to break the heavy silence. He did not ask a single clarifying question. Instead, he reached into his tailored suit jacket, produced a secure federal smartphone, and rapidly dialed a number. He issued a series of clipped alphanumeric authorization codes before demanding immediate access to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network database. He then pulled his own slim laptop from a leather briefcase, connected it to the precinct's secure uplink, and began typing with ferocious speed. Inspector Ramirez remained seated across from me, his eyes darting between the gold cufflink in the evidence bag and the frozen image of my sister laughing on my screen. The local detective was entirely out of his depth, watching a domestic arson case mutate into a federal conspiracy right in front of him. I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow and controlled while Vance's fingers hammered the keyboard. The digital hunt took less than 12 minutes. When Vance finally stopped typing, he let out a low, sharp whistle that echoed off the cinderblock walls. He rotated his laptop toward me. The screen was filled with cascading columns of red numbers offshore, holding shell companies and flagged corporate credit accounts. "Your father is not a wealthy man," Cassidy Vance stated, his voice stripped of its previous bureaucratic polish. "His entire executive empire is a complete mirage." I'm looking at the internal ledgers for his primary holding corporation. He is currently carrying exactly $1.8 million in toxic, unserviceable debt. His creditors have already initiated quiet legal proceedings. He is maximum 3 weeks away from a catastrophic, highly public corporate bankruptcy. I stared at the red numbers illuminating the screen, and the final sick puzzle piece locked seamlessly into place. The betrayal had felt intensely personal, a malicious strike against my independence. But the truth was far more pathetic and significantly more dangerous. Thomas was drowning. He had built his entire identity on suburban prestige, country club memberships, and ruthless corporate dominance. The impending bankruptcy would have stripped him of everything, exposing him as a complete financial failure. He needed immediate, untraceable liquid cash to plug a nearly $2 million hole. Jamal had not just burned my apartment to bully me into giving up my grandfather's trust fund. The $2 million fraudulent insurance payout was specifically calculated to cover Thomas's corporate deficit with a couple of $100,000 left over. They had weaponized my career, torched my home, and casually sacrificed my entire future just to save Thomas from a boardroom embarrassment. Stealing my $5 million trust fund was simply the ultimate golden parachute, ensuring they would emerge from the manufactured crisis infinitely richer. "We have the wire transfer." Vance continued, leaning his forearms on the metal table. "We have the internal routing numbers, the forged appraisal bypass, and the time-stamped video of your sister and brother-in-law committing arson and grand larceny. It is damning. But any high-priced defense attorney will try to compartmentalize the damage. They will claim Jamal acted as a rogue agent to secure an unauthorized commission. They will argue your father received the electronic funds blindly and had no knowledge of the fire. They will try to categorize the trust fund extortion as a separate, messy civil dispute." I met the agent's intense gaze. "You want to tie them all together?" I said, my voice steady. "You want to prove the conspiracy came from the top?" "Exactly." Vance nodded, a predatory gleam appearing in his eyes. "If we want to bring the hammer down with the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, we need to prove this was a coordinated criminal enterprise. RICO charges carry mandatory federal prison sentences that they cannot plea bargain their way out of. But to build a bulletproof RICO indictment, we need a verbal confession. We need Thomas, Jamal, and Sienna on the record in the same room, actively acknowledging the arson, the insurance fraud, and the trust fund extortion as a unified strategy. Ramirez shifted uncomfortably in his metal chair. You are asking a civilian to walk back into a room with people who just firebombed her apartment. I am offering her the chance to bury them permanently, Vance corrected, never breaking eye contact with me. I need you to wear a covert federal wiretap, Cassidy. I need you to go back into the lion's den and get them to brag about their master plan. It is highly volatile, and if they discover the transmitter, your physical safety will be instantly compromised. Before I could formulate a response, the metal table vibrated sharply. My cell phone resting next to the evidence bag lit up with a harsh glare. A text message banner flashed across the locked screen. The sender was my mother, Catherine. She had remained entirely silent during the morning ambush, playing the role of the passive, horrified matriarch while Thomas and Sienna executed their extortion. Now she was delivering the final blow. I tapped the screen and opened the message, pushing the device across the table so both investigators could read the incoming threat. The text was devoid of any maternal warmth. We are having a final family dinner tonight at 7, Catherine had written. You will be there. You will sign the trust relinquishment documents over to your sister without any more theatrical stalling. If you refuse, your father is calling the police precinct to report that you confessed to negligently starting the fire. He will have you arrested for burning down the building. Do not test us, Cassidy. We are done playing games. Vance read the message twice. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. They are actively escalating the extortion, he noted, tapping the glass screen. They are handing us the venue and the motive on a silver platter. The question is whether you have the nerve to walk into that dining room and collect the nails for their coffins. I looked at the text from the woman who had birthed me, a woman who was actively threatening to frame me for a felony to protect her husband's fragile ego and her daughter's greed. The coldness inside me crystallized into absolute unshakable iron. There was no hesitation left to navigate, no lingering familial loyalty to hold me back. They had demanded a final family dinner, completely unaware that they were aggressively setting the table for their own federal takedown. Wire me up, I told the FBI agent, my voice echoing off the sterile walls with lethal certainty. I accept the invitation. The rigid metallic disc of the federal transmitter was taped tightly against my sternum, a cold, heavy anchor resting right over my heart. Agent Vance had been meticulous in the precinct interrogation room, ensuring the microphone was perfectly concealed beneath the thick wool of the borrowed oversized sweater I wore. I drove my soot-stained sedan up the winding, impeccably manicured driveway of my parents' Lake Forest estate, my tires crunching softly against the pristine gravel. The sprawling brick Tudor mansion loomed against the darkening winter sky, its massive arched windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. For 31 years, this imposing structure had represented a fortress of conditional love and suffocating expectations. Tonight, it was merely an active crime scene waiting to be documented. I parked behind Jamal's gleaming luxury SUV and killed the engine. Taking a single measured breath to steady my racing pulse, I stepped out into the freezing air and walked up the stone steps to the heavy oak front door. I did not bother to knock. I turned the polished brass handle and stepped into the grand foyer. The rich scent of roasted garlic, rosemary, and expensive red wine wafted from the formal dining room, a jarring, sickening contrast to the acrid stench of chemical accelerant and burned drywall that still clung stubbornly to my hair and skin. My mother, Catherine, appeared from the kitchen hallway. She wore a pristine, cream-colored cashmere dress, looking every bit the distressed but resilient matriarch she played for her wealthy country club friends. She did not step forward to hug me. She did not ask a single question about my physical well-being, the loss of my irreplaceable personal mementos, or the total destruction of my home. She simply crossed her arms and gestured sharply toward the dining archway. "Everyone is already seated, Cassidy," she said, her voice clipped and utterly devoid of maternal warmth. "Let us get this unpleasant business concluded quickly so we can all move on." I walked past her without a word and entered the dining room. The long mahogany table was formally set with the family's finest antique silver and heavy crystal goblets. At the far end sat my father Thomas, swirling a measure of deep red wine in his glass, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. To his right sat Jamal, checking his expensive chronograph watch with an air of profound boredom. And directly across from my designated seat sat my sister. Sienna did not look like a woman who had committed multiple staggering felonies less than 24 hours prior. She looked positively radiant. Placed conspicuously on the empty velvet-upholstered chair beside her, rather than on the floor where a purse belonged, was a brand-new, structurally flawless Hermes Birkin bag in a striking shade of cobalt blue. The signature gold hardware caught the light from the massive crystal chandelier suspended above the table, glittering like a weapon. "Do you like it?" Sienna asked, catching my gaze, lingering on the leather. She reached over and affectionately patted the bag, a wide, triumphant smile spreading across her face. Jamal's firm was incredibly accommodating with a preliminary advance on the art insurance payout. They fast-tracked a partial wire transfer this afternoon. A girl needs a little retail therapy after experiencing such a stressful family tragedy. Do not you agree? The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the statement was breathtaking. She was openly flaunting the immediate spoils of an interstate wire fraud conspiracy, while the victim of her arson sat directly across from her. I forced myself to maintain a blank, defeated expression, hyper-aware of the hidden microphone absorbing every single syllable of her confession. "It is a very distinctive bag, Sienna," I replied evenly, keeping my voice loud enough for the wire to register clearly. "I am sure it cost an absolute fortune." "Worth every penny," Jamal chimed in, taking a relaxed sip of his wine. "Consider it a small silver lining to a terrible, unfortunate accident." I pulled out my heavy wooden chair and sat down. The moment I was settled, the thin facade of a family dinner instantly evaporated. Thomas did not wait for the first course to be served. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, produced a thick stack of stapled legal documents, and tossed them forcefully across the polished mahogany table. The heavy parchment slid smoothly across the wood, coming to a dead stop directly on top of my pristine porcelain dinner plate. I looked down at the bold capitalized font on the top page. It was a complete, irrevocable relinquishment of my grandfather's $5 million trust fund, transferring total beneficiary control and immediate access directly to Sienna. "We are done playing this exhausting, childish game," Cassidy Thomas stated. His voice was hard, echoing with the boardroom ruthlessness he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers and desperate competitors. "You have proven yourself entirely incapable of managing your own life. Your apartment is a pile of toxic ashes. Your career is functionally over after your little meltdown. You have absolutely nothing left. It is time to let the responsible adults manage the family legacy before you drag our good name into the gutter with you." I stared at the legal papers, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap to prevent them from shaking. "And if I refuse to sign away my grandfather's money?" I asked, projecting a tone of weak defiance. "What exactly is the alternative, Dad?" Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "I am not an entirely heartless man," he said, his tone dripping with weaponized paternal concern. "I have arranged a cashier's check for $50,000. It is sitting in my wall safe right now. You sign those trust papers, you take the 50 grand, and you disappear. You move to a different city, you start completely over, and you never ask this family for another dime. 50,000 is a remarkably generous safety net for someone in your current destitute position." I let out a short, hollow breath, shaking my head slowly. $50,000 in exchange for $5 million. That is quite the generous fresh start. And if I find that offer unacceptable? Jamal shifted in his seat, leaning into the conversation with a predatory, calculating smirk. "If you decide to be stubborn," he said smoothly, "the situation becomes incredibly tragic for you. I have already drafted a sworn legal affidavit for the fire marshal and the corporate insurance investigators. In it, I detail how I stopped by your apartment last night to check on you. I will testify under oath that I found you in a state of severe emotional distress, acting erratically, surrounded by lit candles and open bottles of alcohol. Catherine stepped into the dining room from the hallway, taking her seat next to Thomas. Her face was a mask of solemn, unified agreement. "We will back him up completely, Cassidy," she added coldly, pouring herself a glass of water. "We will tell the police investigators that you have been deeply unstable for months, that you were furious about your financial failures and repeatedly threatened to burn your own life down." Jamal nodded, tapping a finger against the stem of his wineglass. "Arson is a serious felony, Cassidy. When I hand that affidavit over to the Chicago Police Department, they will arrest you for intentionally destroying a residential building. You will go to federal prison for a very long time, and you will still lose the trust fund to legal fees. Or you pick up that pen right now, sign the trust over to your sister, and take your $50,000 consolation prize. The choice is entirely yours." I looked down at the $50,000 cashier's check resting beside the extortion papers, then back up at the three faces, waiting eagerly for my total psychological collapse. I did not scream. I did not flip the heavy mahogany table or succumb to the manufactured panic they were so desperate to witness. Instead, I calmly picked up my solid silver knife and fork, sliced a perfectly medium-rare piece of filet mignon from my plate, and took a slow, deliberate bite. The absolute absence of fear in my demeanor sent a visible ripple of unease around the dining room. Thomas's triumphant sneer faltered, and Jamal shifted his weight, his intimidation tactics suddenly feeling incredibly hollow against my armor of indifference. I swallowed my food, casually dabbing the corners of my mouth with a linen napkin. It was time to deploy the psychological profiling I had meticulously constructed in the back of the FBI surveillance van. My family members were entirely predictable predators, driven by a toxic cocktail of unchecked narcissism and an insatiable need to boast about their own perceived brilliance. I just needed to stroke their egos and let their arrogance do the heavy lifting. "It is a remarkably ruthless strategy," I conceded, letting my shoulders drop just a fraction to project a flawless illusion of defeat. "I have to admit, I genuinely underestimated the sheer scale of your ambition. I assumed this was just about Sienna wanting the grandfather's trust fund to finance her luxury lifestyle. I never imagined you had the stomach to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar corporate insurance fraud just to cover the $1.8 million deficit in your primary holding company, Dad." Thomas stiffened instantly, his crystal wineglass halting halfway to his mouth. The sudden, precise mention of his highly classified corporate debt hit him like a physical blow. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes before his towering ego violently reasserted itself. He slammed his glass down, the dark liquid splashing dangerously close to the rim. "You always were too smart for your own good, Cassidy," he growled, entirely incapable of letting me hold the upper hand. Yes, the holding company was severely overleveraged. It was a temporary cash flow issue that required an immediate, highly creative solution. I am not about to let 30 years of my corporate legacy be dismantled by aggressive creditors just because the market took a temporary downturn. The trust fund secures Sienna's future, and your little fake art collection provided the necessary liquidity to stabilize my executive board. "It is incredibly efficient," I murmured, keeping my tone submissive and laced with manufactured awe. I turned my gaze directly to my brother-in-law, knowing exactly which buttons to push. But the digital execution is what truly baffles me. Bypassing the forensic fire investigations, routing a $2 million fraudulent payout directly into a joint beneficiary account across state banking lines in the middle of the night. That requires an unbelievable level of executive override. So, Jamal, you really bypassed your firm's entire appraisal protocol just to get Dad the cash. Drunk on the validation and his own perceived invincibility, Jamal could not resist taking the credit. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt with a smug, arrogant laugh. "It was embarrassingly easy," Jamal bragged, leaning back in his chair with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Your insurance policy mandated strict internal security, but you failed to realize that as a senior commercial broker, my executive credentials grant me Tier 1 access to the automated claim system." I completely bypassed the mandatory adjuster review by flagging the replica canvases as a verified total loss due to catastrophic chemical combustion. I personally initiated the interstate wire transfer from our corporate reserves directly to Thomas's offshore routing number. No red flags, no corporate oversight, just a clean, instantaneous $2 million injection. I let out a soft, defeated sigh, leaning back in my heavy wooden chair. And the physical fire itself, I asked, keeping my voice pitched perfectly for the federal transmitter taped securely to my sternum. My building has 24-hour lobby security and high-definition hallway cameras. How did you even get the chemical accelerant past the front desk without triggering a suspicious activity report? And how did you guarantee it would burn hot enough to destroy the evidence, but not bring down the entire residential block? Jamal grinned, pouring himself another generous measure of expensive red wine. I walked right through the front doors carrying a standard gym duffel bag. Security guards do not question a wealthy guy with a key fob checking on his sister-in-law's place. The accelerant was a highly concentrated industrial solvent transferred into heavily sealed plastic jugs. It is specifically designed to burn at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and completely consume its own chemical signature. I soaked the floorboards directly under your fake Renaissance canvases, wired a digital thermal detonator to the baseboards, and set a 30-minute delay. By the time the flames hit the ceiling, Sienna and I were already miles away, safely back in the suburbs. It was absolutely brilliant, Sienna chimed in, practically vibrating with gleeful malice. She reached over to stroke her new cobalt blue Hermes bag again. We let ourselves in with the spare emergency key Mom and Dad gave us 2 years ago. While Jamal was setting up the explosive charge in the living room, I went straight into your bedroom and cleared out your jewelry box. You left grandmother's emerald pendant sitting right there on the vanity. It felt incredibly satisfying to finally take back the heirlooms you never deserved. Then we just locked the deadbolt behind us and drove away to watch the smoke from the highway. I turned my attention to the matriarch of the family, who was silently cutting her roasted vegetables with practiced, chilling elegance. "And you, Mom?" I asked, projecting a hollow tone of profound betrayal. "You sat here and gave them the spare key, knowing they were going to firebomb my home. Knowing I could have been asleep in my bed." Catherine did not even look up from her plate. "We knew you were working a late-night restoration shift at the downtown gallery, Cassidy. Thomas tracks your work schedule through your shared digital family calendar. We are not murderers. We simply needed you thoroughly financially devastated so you would stop fighting us on the trust fund relinquishment. It was a necessary correction to put you back in your proper place." I looked around the opulent dining room, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds to ensure the FBI recording equipment picked up the absolute lack of remorse in the room. "So, to be absolutely clear," I said, carefully summarizing their admissions for the federal agents listening just a few miles away. "Dad ordered the destruction of my property to cover a $1.8 million corporate deficit. Jamal committed felony residential arson and executed a $2 million interstate wire fraud to secure the funds. Sienna committed grand larceny by stealing my antique jewelry, and you are all actively using the threat of a fabricated police affidavit to extort my signature on a $5 million trust fund transfer." Thomas rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my meticulous recounting of their crimes. "Yes, Cassidy, that is exactly what we did, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop us. We hold all the cards. We have the money, we have the power, and we have the affidavit ready to send you to federal prison. So stop stalling, pick up the pen, and sign the documents." I looked at the gold-plated pen resting beside the $50,000 check. I had walked into the lion's den surrounded by arrogant predators who believed they had successfully hunted me for sport. But they had just spent the last 20 minutes feeding a flawless, legally binding multi-count RICO confession directly into a federal wiretap. I smiled, a genuine icy expression that finally caused the color to drain entirely out of my father's face. I smiled, a genuine icy expression that finally caused the color to drain entirely out of my father's face. He blinked, the sudden shift in my demeanor violently fracturing his carefully cultivated illusion of absolute control. For 31 years, he had relied on my predictable reactions, my desperate attempts to seek his validation, and my reflexive need to defend myself against his relentless criticism. He had fully expected me to shatter under the weight of their combined treachery, to beg for mercy, or to surrender to the manufactured panic they had so meticulously engineered. Instead, I was radiating a serene, terrifying equilibrium that clearly unsettled the predators circling the table. I reached into my heavy canvas work tote. Jamal instantly tensed his hand, twitching toward the edge of the mahogany table, likely anticipating some pathetic attempt at physical retaliation or a frantic scramble for the door. But my fingers bypassed the hidden pocket containing the FBI transmitter and emerged holding a sleek midnight black Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was a vintage piece, a college graduation gift from the very grandfather whose legacy they were currently attempting to hijack. The heavy gold nib glinted under the light of the crystal chandelier, a fitting instrument for the execution I was about to perform. I pulled the thick stack of stapled legal documents toward me, aligning the edges with deliberate, maddening precision. The silence in the dining room stretched tight, vibrating with an almost electrical current of anticipation. I did not rush the process. I methodically flipped through the heavy parchment pages, skimming the dense paragraphs of legalese with the practiced eye of a woman accustomed to scrutinizing complex corporate contracts. It was a standard, hyper-aggressive relinquishment of beneficiary rights, explicitly drafted to completely sever my access and redirect the $5 million principal directly into a private account solely controlled by my sister. It was exceptionally thorough, leaving zero room for civil arbitration or future claims of coercion. They had clearly paid a very expensive, highly unethical lawyer to ensure this theft was legally immaculate. I reached the final page. The designated signature block sat starkly at the bottom of the parchment, flanked by blank spaces for a date and a notary seal. I uncapped the Mont Blanc. The soft scratch of the gold nib against the heavy paper was the only sound in the cavernous, opulent room. I signed my name with fluid, looping strokes, feeling the intense, greedy stares of my family burning into my hands. But I did not stop at my signature. Beneath my name, utilizing a microscopic, heavily coded legal shorthand I had perfected during my years of reviewing binding financial agreements, I added a single devastating addendum. I pressed the pen firmly into the parchment, etching the caveat directly into the fabric of the transfer agreement. Void and fully reversible upon any federal criminal indictment of the recipient. It was a flawless poison pill, seamlessly integrated into the signature line, effectively turning their ultimate victory document into a ticking financial time bomb. Because the clause was written in complex legal shorthand, it blended perfectly with the dense bureaucratic text printed below the signature line. To the untrained, arrogant eyes of my family, it simply looked like a standard dating format, accompanied by an illegible flourish of ink. Before the ink was entirely dry, Sienna lunged forward. She snatched the documents right out from under my pen, her manicured acrylic nails scraping aggressively against the porcelain plate. She clutched the papers to her chest, her eyes wide with a manic, unadulterated greed. She did not bother to review the signature block. She did not possess the legal comprehension to decode the addendum, even if she had bothered to look. She simply saw the dark ink on the page and knew she had won. "You actually did it!" Sienna laughed, the sound sharp and grating in the quiet room. Her fragile facade of familial concern evaporated instantly, replaced by raw, unfiltered vindictiveness. She waved the documents in the air, practically vibrating with triumph. "I really thought you were going to make us drag you through a messy court battle, Cassidy. But you are just as weak and predictable as Dad always said you were. You gave up without even putting up a real fight." Jamal leaned back in his chair, letting out a loud, obnoxious sigh of profound relief. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the vintage red with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "Smart move," he muttered, taking a celebratory sip. "That is the smartest decision you have made all day. You saved us a lot of unnecessary paperwork." Thomas relaxed his rigid posture, the immense tension draining from his shoulders as he reached forward to slide the $50,000 cashier's check across the table toward me. "There is your fresh start," he stated, his voice dripping with triumphant condescension. "Take it and leave. The family office will begin executing the trust transfer tomorrow morning. We will not be contacting the police about the fire provided you adhere to our agreement and disappear quietly." Sienna clutched her new cobalt blue Hermes bag with her free hand, looking down at me with an expression of supreme disgust. "Look at you," she sneered, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You are officially a penniless, homeless failure. You do not belong in this house, Cassidy. You belong in the gutter with the rest of the trash. Grab your pathetic little check and get out of our sight before we decide to have you arrested for trespassing." I did not touch the check. I did not look at the door. I calmly picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth with slow, agonizing deliberation. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate, picked up my heavy crystal goblet, and took a final leisurely sip of the expensive Cabernet. The wine tasted exceptionally sweet on my tongue. I set the glass down, resting my hands comfortably on the table, and looked directly into my sister's gloating, arrogant eyes. "You should go open the front door, Sienna," I instructed, my voice cutting through the heavy air with lethal, razor-sharp clarity. "Your ride is here." For a split second, total confusion washed over her face. Jamal frowned, glancing toward the arched hallway. Thomas opened his mouth to issue another command, but the words died instantly in his throat. Suddenly, the manicured darkness of the Lake Forest estate was violently shattered. A chaotic, blinding strobe of red and blue lights exploded through the massive dining room windows, painting the antique walls and the horrified faces of my family in alternating flashes of crimson and ice. The absolute silence of the mansion was shredded by the deafening, synchronized blare of federal sirens converging on the driveway. The absolute silence of the mansion was shredded by the deafening, synchronized blare of federal sirens converging on the driveway. The heavy, rhythmic pulse of the flashing lights transformed the formal dining room into a chaotic discotheque of crimson and sapphire strobing aggressively across the imported wallpaper. For a fraction of a second, the trio sitting across from me remained entirely paralyzed, their brains utterly incapable of reconciling their perceived invulnerability with the overwhelming reality of a full-scale tactical assault manifesting on their manicured front lawn. Then the reinforced oak of the front door gave way with a catastrophic, splintering crash. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceilings like a bomb detonating inside the grand foyer. "Federal agents search and arrest warrants. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them." The thunderous command rolled down the hallway, accompanied by the heavy synchronized thud of reinforced tactical boots slamming against the imported Italian marble floors. Inspector Ramirez was the first to round the corner into the dining room, his service weapon drawn and held at the low ready, his face a mask of absolute uncompromising authority. Behind him poured a heavily armed tactical team of FBI agents, clad in dark Kevlar vests, their flashlights cutting blinding swaths through the ambient glow of the crystal chandelier. The static crackle of police radios and the sharp-barked orders of agents securing the perimeter completely swallowed the soft classical music that had been playing in the background. The arrogant facade that had defined my family for my entire existence shattered with the fragility of thin glass. Thomas abruptly shoved his chair backward, his mouth gaping open in uncomprehending horror. The stem of his crystal goblet snapped in his tightening grip, sending a splash of expensive vintage wine bleeding across the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. He raised his hands instinctively, his ruthless boardroom bravado entirely extinguished by the presence of federal tactical armor in his private sanctuary. He did not issue a single command. He simply shrank back against the wall, a hollow shell of a patriarch watching his kingdom fall. Jamal reacted with the erratic, panicked instinct of a cornered animal. He lunged upward, his heavy chair clattering violently to the floor behind him, his hand darting frantically toward the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket where his phone was stashed. He never even managed to touch the fabric. "Do not move!" An agent roared, closing the distance with terrifying athletic speed. Before Jamal could formulate a single syllable of protest, two massive federal agents descended upon him, They grabbed his lapels, spun him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany dining table. The impact rattled the antique silver cutlery and sent Thomas's abandoned $50,000 cashier's check fluttering aimlessly to the floor. Jamal gasped, his cheek pressed forcefully against the wood, right next to the cooling remnants of his filet mignon. The distinct metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply as his wrists were wrenched securely behind his back. "I am a senior executive," Jamal shouted, his voice muffled against the table, his former arrogance replaced by desperate outrage. "I demand my lawyer. You have no right to enter this property. I know my rights." Sienna unleashed a piercing, hysterical shriek, completely drowning out her husband's demands. She scrambled backward, instinctively clutching the forged trust documents to her chest, as if the parchment could somehow shield her from the incoming federal indictment. She tripped over the hem of her designer dress, stumbling into the corner of the room. A second pair of agents flanked her immediately. One agent seized her wrists, expertly stripping the papers from her grasp and forcing her arms behind her back. She was pushed forward, bent over the edge of the dining table, right beside her immobilized husband, her perfectly styled hair falling in a disheveled curtain across her face. "This is a mistake," Sienna shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered terror as the cold steel clamped around her wrists. "You cannot do this. Do you have any idea who my father is? Let go of me. We have not done anything wrong." Inspector Ramirez stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the frantic, struggling woman. "Sienna Vance," he stated, his voice cutting through her panic with chilling formality. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, interstate wire fraud, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you utilize it immediately." As Ramirez continued reciting the Miranda rights over the din of the securing operation, a female federal agent stepped calmly through the perimeter of tactical officers. She was holding a stack of heavy plastic evidence bags and a digital camera. She approached Sienna, who was still hyperventilating against the edge of the mahogany table, and reached out with a gloved hand. Sienna flinched, sobbing hysterically, as the female agent's fingers brushed against her collarbone. The agent did not hesitate. With practiced clinical precision, she located the heavy gold clasp resting at the nape of Sienna's neck. A swift click, and the antique emerald pendant, the exact heirloom stolen from my bedroom vanity less than 24 hours ago, slid free, confiscating stolen property recovered directly on the suspect's person. The female agent announced loudly, ensuring her body camera recorded the action. She dropped the glittering emerald into a clear evidence bag, sealing it with a sharp zip. Sienna let out a strangled, breathless sob, watching her pilfered trophy disappear into federal custody. But the agent was not finished. She pivoted smoothly toward the velvet-upholstered chair where Sienna had previously been sitting. She reached down and grasped the handles of the brand-new, structurally flawless cobalt-blue Hermes Birkin bag. "No," Sienna wailed, twisting uselessly against the grip of the arresting officers, fresh tears ruining her meticulous makeup. "That is mine. I just bought that. You cannot take my bag." The female agent held the luxury leather up, examining the gold hardware with total indifference. Confiscating assets explicitly purchased with the proceeds of an illegal wire fraud transaction, the agent stated, tagging the handle with a barcoded federal evidence loop. "This is now property of the United States government." Throughout the overwhelming, violent orchestration of the raid, Catherine had remained completely paralyzed in her chair, her hands hovering above her plate in a state of catatonic shock. But as the female agent bagged the Birkin, and Jamal continued to shout redundant legal threats from his position pressed against the table, the matriarch's shock finally mutated into absolute, unrestrained hysteria. Catherine leapt to her feet, her cream-colored cashmere dress snagging on the edge of the table. She began screaming, a high-pitched, frantic sound that tore through the dining room. "What is going on?" she shrieked, her eyes darting wildly between the tactical agents, her handcuffed daughter, and Thomas, who was still standing with his hands raised in silent, cowardly surrender. "Thomas, do something. Call the chief of police. Call the mayor. Why are they treating our children like criminals? What is happening in my house?" She lunged toward Inspector Ramirez, her hands outstretched in a frantic, demanding gesture, but a federal agent stepped smoothly into her path, holding up a rigid, gloved palm to halt her advance. Catherine recoiled, hyperventilating, her perfectly cultivated country club persona completely obliterated by the raw, terrifying reality of a federal raid. She spun toward me, her eyes wide with a desperate, uncomprehending panic searching for any semblance of an explanation as the FBI methodically dismantled her entire empire right in front of her. I met my mother's frantic, searching stare with eyes as hard and unyielding as glacial ice. She was silently begging for a lifeline, desperately searching my expression for some miraculous revelation that this was all a terrible, easily rectified misunderstanding. I offered her absolutely nothing. The sterile, aggressive glare of the tactical flashlights swept across the imported antique wallpaper, illuminating the exact moment the fragile, transactional bonds of my family entirely disintegrated. There is absolutely no loyalty among predators when the trap snaps shut, and the crushing, inescapable pressure of a federal indictment is a remarkably effective solvent. The illusion of their untouchable suburban royalty evaporated into the freezing air, leaving behind only the pathetic, scrambling reality of cornered criminals. It started with Jamal, the polished, untouchable corporate broker who had casually firebombed my apartment less than a day ago was currently pressed face first against a spreading puddle of spilled Cabernet Sauvignon. The cold steel of the federal handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, and the sharp, metallic ratcheting sound seemed to trigger a primal, desperate survival instinct. The sheer, suffocating reality of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was crashing down on him. He realized instantly that he was the most exposed variable in this criminal equation. He had physically planted the highly volatile accelerant. He had initiated the fraudulent interstate wire transfer. If he did not secure a protective deal, right this exact second, he was going to spend the next 3 decades decaying in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Jamal violently twisted his neck, his cheeks slipping against the wet mahogany as he gasped for air. He began to thrash against the unyielding grip of the 2 massive federal agents holding him pinned to the table. "Do not pin this entirely on me," he roared, his voice cracking with absolute raw panic. He jerked his cuffed wrists upward, managing to point a trembling, restricted finger directly across the chaotic dining room. "Look at him. Look at Thomas. This was his operation. I am just a corporate broker." Sienna let out a horrified, betrayed screech, but Jamal completely ignored his wife. He was fiercely fighting for his own survival, now eagerly throwing the patriarch of the family directly to the wolves. "He begged me to do it," Jamal screamed at Inspector Ramirez, spitting the words out in a frantic, breathless rush. His holding company was bleeding out. The corporate creditors were preparing to file for immediate hostile liquidation by Friday afternoon. Thomas came to me. He planned the entire insurance bypass protocol. He explicitly promised me a 30% cut of the $2 million payout if I handled the physical logistics of the fire. I have all the text messages on an encrypted application. I can give you the digital recovery keys right now. I want full federal immunity. I will testify against him. I will testify against all of them." The vicious, unhesitating betrayal echoed through the grand dining room, hanging in the air like toxic smoke. Thomas stood frozen against the expensive wallpaper, his hands still raised in a posture of cowardly surrender. He stared at his son-in-law, his face draining of whatever color remained until his skin matched the pale, sickly gray of the winter sky outside. The absolute humiliating destruction of his ego, the sudden realization that his own carefully selected, ruthlessly groomed protégé was eagerly selling him out to save his own skin, struck the patriarch with the physical force of a freight train. His entire empire, built on intimidation and enforced loyalty, was crumbling into federal evidence. Thomas let out a sudden wet gasp. His hands dropped from the surrender position, violently clutching the center of his chest. He staggered forward, his perfectly tailored suit jacket crumpling as his fingers dug frantically into his own sternum. He tried to speak, tried to issue one final authoritative command to silence Jamal's panicked rambling, but all that escaped his lips was a ragged, wheezing rattle. Sweat beaded instantly on his forehead. His knees buckled simultaneously. He tipped backward, his substantial weight crashing heavily into one of the velvet-upholstered dining chairs. The chair skidded violently against the hardwood floor before slamming into the antique mahogany credenza. Thomas slumped over his eyes, rolling back in his head, his jaw slackening as his face contorted in genuine agonizing pain. A massive, stress-induced cardiac episode had seized his heart physically, dropping him as swiftly as the federal raid had dropped his status. Medic. One of the tactical agents barked immediately, pressing 2 fingers against Thomas's neck to check for a pulse while keeping his service weapon trained on the room. We need EMTs in the dining room immediately. Suspect is experiencing a severe medical event. The agents maintained their secure perimeter entirely unbothered by the medical emergency unfolding in front of them. Catherine watched her husband collapse into a wheezing, semi-conscious heap, and the last remaining thread of her pristine country club sanity finally snapped. Her entire world was being catalogued into plastic evidence bags. She let out a guttural, wretched wail and sank to the floor. The luxurious cream-colored cashmere of her dress pooled around her knees on the cold marble tiles. She crawled. The woman who had spent 30 years looking down her nose at the entire world literally shuffled across the floor on her hands and knees until she reached my chair. She threw her arms forward, her manicured hands desperately grabbing at my ankles. Her grip was tight, her fingers digging frantically into the fabric of my slacks. "Cassidy, please!" Catherine sobbed, her face completely ruined by streaming tears and smeared cosmetics. She looked up at me, her expression a grotesque mask of pleading desperation. "You have to stop this. Tell them it is a massive mistake. Tell the agents we were just negotiating a private family matter. We are your family. He is your father. You cannot let them take us away to prison. I am begging you. Cassidy, please. Make them stop." I looked down at the woman gripping my legs. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual familial loyalty, no tragic sense of loss. The emotional well had run completely dry, scorched earth, left in the wake of their relentless cruelty. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pulled my legs back. When she refused to let go, her nails digging harder into my skin, I sharply and coldly kicked my heavy boots forward, forcefully, knocking her hands away from my shins. Catherine recoiled, gasping loudly as if I had physically struck her across the face. I stared down at her pathetic, groveling form, casually adjusting the cuffs of my borrowed oversized sweater to ensure the federal transmitter remained perfectly concealed. I watched her weep, offering no comfort, no salvation, and absolutely no mercy. "Not my problem," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling, detached finality that cut cleanly through the blaring sirens and the shouting federal agents. "You should have been more careful." 30 days later, the flashing red and blue lights that had illuminated my family's downfall were replaced by the cold, fluorescent glare of federal courtrooms and corporate legal offices. The swiftness of the justice system, when motivated by a meticulously documented racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act conspiracy, was truly a marvel to witness. Thomas survived his stress-induced cardiac event, but waking up in a heavily guarded hospital wing was merely the prelude to his absolute destruction. The federal government did not offer sympathy for his failing health or his ruined pride. They offered subpoenas, asset seizures, and an unrelenting financial guillotine. Under the draconian provisions of the RICO Act, the FBI and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network moved with lethal synchronicity. They did not just arrest my family, they surgically dismantled their entire existence, ripping the wealth from their hands overnight. Every single bank account tied to Thomas's name, every offshore shell corporation he had spent decades concealing, and every high-yield investment portfolio was instantly frozen. The sprawling Lake Forest estate, once a towering monument to my mother's insufferable vanity and the epicenter of their social dominance, was locked down. Its wrought iron gates were chained tight and tagged with aggressive federal seizure notices. Catherine was forced to vacate the premises under armed escort, with nothing but 2 standard-issue suitcases of permitted non-designer clothing. She transitioned instantly from a wealthy country club matriarch to a destitute dependent relying on the begrudging, resentful charity of distant relatives who were terrified of being implicated in the fallout. The financial strangulation was absolute and unforgiving. The insurance conglomerate alerted by Agent Vance's task force to the highly fraudulent nature of the apartment fire executed an immediate aggressive clawback. The $2 million payout that Jamal had so arrogantly wired into Thomas's corporate reserves was forcefully reversed. The electronic funds vanished from the ledgers in a matter of keystrokes, leaving a massive gaping wound in the very heart of Thomas's primary holding company. Without that stolen liquidity to plug his toxic debt, the corporate mirage Thomas had spent his life protecting instantly vaporized. The blood in the water attracted the sharks before the week was out. His aggressive creditors already circling before the Arson immediately filed for involuntary catastrophic bankruptcy. The collapse was not quiet, and it was certainly not dignified. It played out across the front pages of local financial journals and business blogs. Decades of manufactured suburban prestige were dragged through the mud, exposing my father not as a ruthless corporate titan, but as a desperate, overleveraged fraud who had resorted to burning down his own daughter's home to cover his catastrophic failures. The boardroom humiliation he had feared more than death was now his permanent, unshakable legacy, stripping him of the one thing he valued above his own family. But the most devastating blow, the absolute masterstroke of the entire operation, was waiting quietly in the fine print of the legal documents they had forced upon me that night at the dining table. Agent Vance had arranged a secure meeting in a sterile downtown conference room to finalize the seizure of assets and the processing of evidence. Sitting across from a panel of federal prosecutors and the heavily sweating attorneys who previously managed my grandfather's estate, I finally revealed the trap I had laid in plain sight. The lawyers, terrified of being indicted in the RICO charges, practically scrambled over each other to comply with the federal directives. They pulled up the trust transfer document, the very parchment Sienna had snatched from my hands in her moment of blind, arrogant greed. I directed their attention to the bottom of the page right beneath my flowing signature. The microscopic, heavily coded legal addendum I had etched into the paper was scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Void and fully reversible upon any federal criminal indictment of the recipient. The room fell entirely silent as the senior trust attorney read the clause aloud, his voice trembling slightly as he realized the magnitude of the legal snare. The mechanism was flawless, unassailable, and brutally efficient. Sienna and Thomas had not just been arrested. They had been formally and federally indicted by a grand jury on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The very act of their indictment triggered the poison pill I had embedded in the contract. The transfer of the $5 million trust fund to Sienna was instantly nullified. It was automatically revoked, the capital rebounding securely away from her frozen, seized accounts, before the federal government could even lay claim to it as illicit proceeds. The trust charter, written by my grandfather with strict morality clauses, demanded a beneficiary with an unblemished record. With Thomas facing decades in federal prison and Sienna indicted alongside her husband, there was only one remaining heir who possessed a clean legal background and the rightful bloodline claim. Me. The attorneys frantically typed on their encrypted laptops, initiating the immediate reversal to correct the chain of custody. In less than 45 minutes, the entire $5 million principal, along with years of accrued compounding interest, was transferred into a secure private account under my sole and exclusive control. Sienna's desperate, malicious grab for wealth had not only failed, but it had permanently locked her out of the family fortune while simultaneously handing me the keys to the kingdom. She had handed over the legal ammunition required to finalize her own poverty. I sat in the plush leather chair of the conference room, staring at the digital confirmation on the banking tablet pushed across the table by a relieved attorney. The numbers glowing on the screen represented absolute, untouchable freedom. It was not just the money, it was the sheer vindication. My family had burned my life to ashes, convinced I was too weak to strike back. They had viewed my independence as a threat and my empathy as a vulnerability. They had orchestrated a staggering criminal enterprise simply to maintain their comfortable illusions of superiority. Now Thomas was a bankrupt, disgraced felon, recovering in a secure prison ward, facing the total liquidation of his life's work. Jamal was actively cooperating with prosecutors desperately singing to save himself while dealing with the total ruin of his career and reputation. Sienna was sitting in a stark federal holding cell, permanently stripped of her stolen emeralds and her designer bags, utterly penniless and facing hard time. And Catherine was exiled from her precious high society, forced to watch her carefully curated world dissolve into a cautionary tale on the evening news. I picked up my canvas tote bag, thanked the federal agents and the pale, trembling attorneys for their time, and walked out of the high-rise building into the crisp, biting wind of the Chicago afternoon. The acrid smell of smoke that had haunted my senses for weeks was finally gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of total victory. I had lost an apartment and a few replaceable possessions, but in exchange, I had secured a $5 million empire and surgically removed the toxic infection that had poisoned my life since birth. I hailed a luxury sedan to take me back to my upscale hotel suite, my mind already calculating the incredible trajectory of my new, beautifully unencumbered future. The transition from the high-rise offices of downtown Chicago to the somber environment of the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse felt like stepping into an execution chamber for the Vance family legacy. The grand dining room where my mother had once orchestrated her social triumphs was a distant memory. Now inside the wood-paneled federal courtroom, the air was thick with the sterile scent of floor polish and the quiet, tense murmurs of legal representation. The strobe lights of the tactical raid had long faded, replaced by the unyielding, steady glare of recessed ceiling lights that exposed every flaw, every crack, and every desperate tremor in the remaining members of my biological family. Catherine sat at the wooden spectator bench, looking completely unrecognizable. The perfectly coiffed hair, the crisp cashmere dresses, and the polished porcelain smile that had defined her for decades had completely disintegrated over the past 30 days. She looked haggard, her posture severely stooped, wearing an oversized, wrinkled gray cardigan that swallowed her frail frame. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she clutched a damp tissue, her eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by sleepless nights and public disgrace. Across the aisle, seated behind the defense table, Sienna and Jamal looked equally diminished. Stripped of their designer clothes and custom jewelry, they wore standard-issue orange jumpsuit separates their expressions a volatile mix of terror and residual defiance. The federal judge, an imposing woman with sharp eyes and an absolute intolerance for white-collar corruption, called the bail hearing to order. Before the defense counsel could even launch into their prepared arguments regarding community ties, Catherine erupted from her seat. Disregarding all courtroom decorum, she scrambled toward the wooden bar separating the spectators from the legal well, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate desperation that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Your Honor, please, I beg of you, show some mercy," Catherine wept, her manicured nails catching on the polished wooden partition as she leaned toward the bench. "They are not criminals. They are good people who made a terrible, tragic mistake under immense financial pressure. Look at my daughter. She is terrifyingly fragile. She cannot survive in a federal holding facility." The judge's gavel slammed down once, a sharp, unyielding crack that vibrated through the courtroom. "Decorum will be maintained, ma'am, or you will be removed by the marshals immediately," the judge warned, her voice dripping with ice. Catherine flinched, but instead of retreating, she spun around, her wild, tear-stained gaze locking directly onto me. She rushed toward where I sat beside the federal prosecutors, ignoring her own attorney's frantic hand gestures to sit down. She fell against the wooden partition, her face contorted in a grotesque display of manufactured maternal agony, weaponizing the exact emotional manipulation she had used to keep me compliant for 31 years. "Cassidy, please, you have the power to stop this madness right now," Catherine pleaded, her voice dropping to a harsh, theatrical whisper that carried across the silent room. "You have the $5 million trust fund now. Grandfather's money is entirely in your account. Use it to post their bail. I am begging you as your mother. Jamal can secure a signature bond if you back it with the principal. Sienna needs to come home. Blood is thicker than water, Cassidy. No matter what happened, she is your sister. She is your own flesh and blood. You cannot leave her to rot in a cell just to satisfy your own vindictiveness. Think of the family name. Think of what your grandfather would say if he saw you destroying us like this. I sat perfectly still, my spine aligned against the leather backrest of the chair. The emotional blackmail that would have once provoked a defensive, desperate panic inside me now felt entirely pathetic. It was a phantom language spoken by a ghost from a life I had already discarded. I did not flinch. I did not offer a sympathetic nod, and I certainly did not reach for my wallet. The $5 million was the price of my liberation, not a rescue fund for the predators who had attempted to extort me while my life was burning to the ground. When the prosecution was called to present its argument against release, I stood up calmly. I smoothed the front of my tailored blazer and walked deliberately toward the witness stand. The click of my boots against the courtroom floor was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I took the oath, sat down, and adjusted the microphone with precise, cold efficiency. I looked directly at the judge, completely bypassing the desperate, burning glares of my sister and brother-in-law. Your Honor, I am here today to deliver a factual victim impact statement regarding the defendants, Sienna and Jamal Vance. I began, my voice clear, steady, and entirely devoid of emotional tremor. The defense argues that my family represents a stable, nonviolent presence with deep community ties. The reality is that these individuals pose an immediate severe flight risk and possess a documented capacity for calculated violence. Sienna shifted violently in her chair, her handcuffs clattering against the metal table, but the marshals behind her instantly placed a warning hand on her shoulder. Less than 24 hours before their arrest, Jamal Vance deliberately firebombed my primary residence, utilizing corporate resources to conceal the transaction. I continued, my gaze remaining locked on the judge. They didn't just target a structure, they targeted my life, fully aware that I was inside. When that physical violence failed to destroy me, they did not retreat. Instead, they escalated to an orchestrated, multi-layered campaign of remorseless extortion. They utilized forged corporate documents, manufactured a fraudulent criminal narrative regarding my professional standing, and physically stripped family heirlooms from my person, all while holding a $50,000 check over my head as a psychological weapon to force my absolute silence and compliance. I paused, letting the clinical weight of the details settle heavily over the courtroom. I reached into my folder, pulling out the official transcripts of the encrypted communications Jamal had traded for a prosecution deal alongside the structural analysis of the fire. The trust documents they forced me to sign under duress were explicitly designed to hide their shifting corporate assets before their creditors could initiate hostile liquidation, I stated with absolute finality. Their financial resources are deeply entangled in offshore shell companies that the white-collar task force is still actively tracing. If they are granted bail, they possess both the liquid capital and the global connections to flee federal jurisdiction before this case ever reaches a jury. They have shown zero remorse, zero accountability, and an absolute willingness to use arson and financial ruin to eliminate anyone who threatens their illusion of control. I ask that bail be denied in its entirety to ensure public safety and the integrity of this upcoming trial. I stepped down from the stand, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute composure, and walked back to my seat. Catherine looked as though she had been physically drained of air, her mouth open in a silent, horrified gasp. The judge did not hesitate. She reviewed the filed prosecution logs for less than 30 seconds before looking down over her glasses at the defense table. The nature of these crimes goes far beyond simple corporate mismanagement, the judge stated, her voice booming with institutional authority. The court finds the evidence of premeditated arson, coordinated extortion, and substantial flight risk to be overwhelming. Bail is denied for both Jamal and Sienna Vance. They will remain in federal custody pending trial. The judge's gavel slammed down with the definitive force of a guillotine block. Sienna let out a strangled, desperate wail as the marshals immediately stood up, gripping her arms to lead her through the secure side door. Jamal sank his head into his cuffed hands, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his permanent confinement finalized. I picked up my leather portfolio, turned my back on my mother's renewed frantic sobbing, and walked out into the bright afternoon light, leaving the ruins of the Vance legacy securely behind bars. The heavy reinforced oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me with a resounding definitive thud, instantly muffling my mother's wretched theatrical sobbing. I stepped into the expansive marble-clad corridor of the federal courthouse. Blinding afternoon sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the hall, casting long, sharp shadows across the meticulously polished floors. I adjusted my grip on my leather portfolio, savoring the absolute uncorrupted quiet of the corridor. I fully intended to walk straight to the elevators, descend to the ground floor, and leave this miserable chapter of my life behind forever. But the Vance family, even in their utter ruination, always demanded one final pathetic word. I had not even made it halfway down the cavernous corridor when a shadow detached itself from the darkened alcove near the public restrooms. Thomas stepped directly into my path, deliberately blocking my route to the exit. The federal judge had granted him a highly restricted temporary medical release pending his own trial due to his severe cardiac event, but the man standing before me was a terrifyingly hollowed-out version of the ruthless patriarch I had known my entire life. His skin was the color of wet ash, devoid of its usual arrogant flush. His tailored, expensive suit hung off his shrinking, deteriorated frame like a borrowed shroud, and he leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane just to remain upright. A thick black GPS monitoring device bulged visibly beneath the hem of his trousers, a constant humiliating reminder that he was now property of the federal justice system. Despite his catastrophic physical decline, his eyes burned with a manic, unadulterated hatred. "You cold-blooded monster!" Thomas spat his voice, a ragged, wheezing hiss that echoed harshly off the cold marble walls. He did not attempt to strike me. He completely lacked the physical strength, and the dozen armed federal marshals lingering near the security checkpoint would have tackled him to the ground before he could even raise a hand. Instead, he relied on the only weapon he had left in his entirely depleted arsenal, his venom. "You destroyed your own family," he rasped, taking a shaky, agonizing step forward, his knuckles turning pure white as he gripped the handle of his cane. "You orchestrated this entire bloodbath. You watched your own sister get locked in a federal cage without blinking. You watched my life's work get shredded by government vultures, and you sat there smiling. You are no daughter of mine. You are a sociopath. You are a parasite who fed on my success, lived under my roof, and then poisoned the well." I stopped walking. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact, and I certainly did not offer him the defensive, stammering apologies he had spent 31 years violently extracting from me. I simply observed him. I looked at his shaking hands, his pale, cracked lips, and the pathetic, desperate rage radiating from his failing heart. It was genuinely fascinating to watch the total, undeniable collapse of a tyrant. The absolute terror radiating from his pores was intoxicating. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Thomas opened his mouth to launch into another barrage of vicious curses, but I did not give him the oxygen to continue his tirade. I unzipped my leather portfolio with smooth, deliberate precision. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, sealed manila folder. I held it out between us, suspending it in the empty air, forcing him to reach out for it. He hesitated, his eyes darting from the folder to my face with deep paranoid suspicion, before his trembling fingers snatched the envelope from my grasp. "Open it," I instructed coldly, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Thomas fumbled with the metal clasp, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. He pulled out the stack of heavy watermarked legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the bold capitalized header printed across the top page. His jaw immediately slackened. "That is a strict permanent federal restraining order." I explained, my tone as casual as if I were reading a grocery list. signed, authorized, and fully executed by the judge less than 10 minutes ago. It legally bars you, Catherine, and any individual acting on your behalf from contacting me, approaching me, or attempting to communicate with me through any medium whatsoever. You are to remain a minimum of 500 feet away from my person, my residence, and my place of business at all times. If you so much as send an email, if you dial my phone number, or if you ask a mutual acquaintance to pass along a message, you will be in direct, undeniable violation of a federal mandate, and your highly restricted medical release will be instantly revoked. You will be dragged out of your cheap motel and thrown directly into a concrete holding cell. Thomas stared at the paper, his hands shaking so violently the stiff pages rattled against each other. "You think a piece of paper matters now?" he sneered, though the aggressive bravado was incredibly weak and entirely unconvincing. "You have already taken everything. There is nothing left for you to destroy." "Not everything," I corrected smoothly, stepping half a pace closer to him and watching him instinctively flinch. "There is one final piece of business we need to conclude before we part ways permanently." I watched his eyes narrow, a flicker of genuine apprehension breaking through his manufactured rage. He knew the financial guillotine had already fallen on his empire, but he clearly did not comprehend the absolute finality of my execution strategy. "With your assets entirely frozen under the federal RICO indictments, and your corporate bank accounts aggressively seized by the government, your creditors were incredibly eager to mitigate their massive losses," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp clarity. "They did not wait for the dust to settle or for your lawyers to file meaningless appeals. The bank officially foreclosed on the Lake Forest estate last week." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He knew this fact. The humiliating eviction notice had been the final fatal blow to Catherine's rapidly deteriorating sanity, but he did not know what happened after the locks were changed. "The property went up for a closed-door expedited bank auction early this morning," I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper, ensuring every word landed with maximum devastating impact. "The bank was desperate for immediate liquidity. They wanted the toxic asset off their books before the media circus surrounding your criminal trial fully escalated. They accepted a rock-bottom, drastically reduced offer without a second thought." "Who?" Thomas gasped, his grip on his cane slipping slightly as he stared at me in total horror. "Who bought my house?" I smiled. It was the exact same icy, terrifying expression I had given him at the dining table right before the FBI breached his reinforced doors. "I did," I replied. Thomas physically staggered backward, his shoulders slamming into the marble wall for support. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air seemed to completely evacuate from his collapsing lungs. "I purchased the beloved Vance family mansion this morning," I confirmed, letting the absolute cruelty of the reality wash over him like a freezing tidal wave. "I bought the manicured lawns, the vaulted ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, and the custom mahogany dining table where you sat and told me I was a worthless failure." In the most poetic part of the entire transaction, Thomas the I bypassed the tedious mortgage process entirely. "I paid for your repossessed kingdom completely in cash, utilizing the $5 million trust fund you so generously surrendered to me." The psychological destruction was absolute and instantaneous. He was not just defeated, he was entirely erased from the map. His legacy, his fortress, and his hoarded wealth now legally belonged to the very daughter he had systematically abused, belittled, and underestimated her entire life. "Enjoy the cheap motel, Thomas," I said, turning smoothly on my heel. "I have a massive estate to remodel." I walked down the sunlit corridor, the sharp, authoritative click of my boots echoing triumphantly through the hall, leaving the ruined patriarch gasping for air in the cold shadows. 6 months elapsed, turning the crisp autumn air into a sweltering, oppressive Chicago summer. The grinding, methodical machinery of the federal justice system had processed the Vance family with a ruthless efficiency that left absolutely no room for appeals or lingering delusions of grandeur. The final sentencing hearing arrived not with a dramatic explosion of courtroom theatrics, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of inevitable doom. I sat in the polished gallery, flanked by the prosecution team, watching as the absolute destruction of my abusers was formally entered into the public record. The presiding judge, her expression etched with deep disgust, for the sheer arrogance of their crimes, did not mince words. She looked down from her elevated bench, her gaze sweeping over the shattered remnants of the people who had once believed themselves utterly untouchable. Jamal was instructed to stand first. His previous courtroom bravado had completely evaporated during his half-year stint in pre-trial detention. His shoulders were permanently hunched, and his eyes remained fixed on the scuffed wooden floorboards. The judge methodically listed his convictions, highlighting the calculated malice required to firebomb an occupied residential building for financial gain. For the charges of first-degree arson and severe coordinated insurance fraud, Jamal was sentenced to a mandatory 10 years in a high-security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He did not utter a single word as the marshals stepped forward, gripping his arms to escort him to the transport vans. There was no final glance backward, only the hollow, shuffling gait of a man who had entirely forfeited his own life. Sienna was called next. The stark orange jumpsuit hung loosely over her significantly thinned frame. The glossy, perfectly curated aesthetic she had weaponized her entire life was gone, replaced by pallid skin, unkempt hair, and trembling hands. Her defense attorney had pleaded for leniency, citing her lack of prior criminal history and her supposed manipulation by her husband. The judge fiercely rejected the narrative. The federal investigation had unequivocally proven her active, enthusiastic participation as an accomplice in the extortion and the fraudulent trust transfer. For her direct role in the conspiracy, Sienna was handed a firm 5-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. As the gavel struck the sounding block, she let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, her knees buckling slightly before the guards caught her and led her away to begin her half-decade of absolute confinement, permanently stripping her of the luxury and privilege she worshipped. Thomas was the only indicted conspirator who managed to evade a physical prison cell, though his alternative was arguably a fate he considered worse than death. His medical records, extensively verified by court-appointed cardiologists, confirmed that his failing heart could not withstand the rigors of federal incarceration. However, the court did not offer him a reprieve from punishment. Sparing him a concrete cell, the judge sentenced him to the maximum allowable term of highly restrictive, heavily monitored probation. His travel was permanently restricted, his communications surveilled, and his movements tracked by the thick GPS monitor he would wear for the remainder of his days. But the ultimate fatal blow to Thomas's ego was the financial and professional execution handed down from the bench. His total catastrophic bankruptcy was officially finalized, wiping out every hidden offshore account and liquid asset the federal agents had seized. Furthermore, the judge imposed a permanent lifetime ban barring Thomas from ever holding a corporate directorship, executive position, or financial advisory role in any capacity. He was legally branded a radioactive fraud, stripped of his title, his influence, and his very identity. He slumped in his chair, a broken, bankrupt shell of a man staring blankly ahead at a future completely devoid of power and relevance. With the legal hammer officially dropped, the final domino in the Vance family collapse tipped over, crushing Catherine beneath its weight. Stripped entirely of her husband's illicit wealth, her stolen social status, and the Lake Forest mansion I now legally owned, she was forcefully expelled from the insulated bubble of high society. The transition was brutal and completely unceremonious. The country club memberships were instantly revoked due to unpaid dues. Her designer wardrobes were seized by bankruptcy liquidators, and the sycophantic friends who had once attended her lavish dinner parties vanished, like smoke, terrified of the social contagion her presence now brought. With no savings, no employable skills, and a toxic public reputation, Catherine was forced to rely on the meager assistance program she had spent her entire life aggressively mocking. She relocated from a sprawling gated estate into a tiny state-subsidized studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The cramped, dimly lit unit smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and old linoleum, a far cry from the vaulted ceilings and imported marble she felt she was fundamentally owed. The neighborhood was loud, the heating was inconsistent, and her view consisted entirely of a brick wall and a rusted chain-link fence. But the reality of her poverty did not stop at her front door. To meet the strict requirements of her housing subsidy and to afford basic groceries, the former matriarch of the Vance Empire was forced to enter the workforce for the very first time in her 60 years. Her new domain was not a charity gala or a luxury boutique, but Lane 4 of a discount grocery store. Wearing a stiff polyester uniform vest that scratched against her neck and a plastic name tag, Catherine spent 40 hours a week standing on an anti-fatigue mat under harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights. She spent her days scanning barcodes, bagging bruised produce, and enduring the impatient sighs of hurried commuters. The hands that had once worn multi-carat diamonds and poured vintage wine now ached from hauling heavy bags of dog food and gallons of milk across the scanner belt. Her feet swelled, her back throbbed, and her pride was systematically pulverized hour by grueling hour. Every time a former acquaintance or a familiar face from her past life happened to wander into the store, she would shrink behind her register, her face burning with an all-consuming, inescapable humiliation as she was forced to ask them if they had found everything they needed. The destruction was absolutely complete. The predators who had burned my apartment mocked my existence and attempted to steal my future had been surgically dismantled by their own greed. They had gambled everything on the assumption that I was too weak to fight back, blinded by their own towering arrogance. In return, I had secured my absolute freedom, safeguarded my grandfather's legacy, and claimed the unparalleled satisfaction of watching the architects of my suffering pay the ultimate permanent price. The physical manifestation of my victory required a stage fitting for the empire I was building. Over the next 8 months, I poured my energy, my meticulous attention to detail, and my newly acquired capital into completely gutting the Lake Forest estate. I stripped away every trace of Catherine's garish country club aesthetic and ruthlessly eradicated Thomas's suffocating dark-paneled gloom. I did not just renovate the property, I exorcised it. I tore down the walls that had trapped me in a cycle of perpetual inadequacy and shattered the physical boundaries of their arrogance. In their place, I constructed a fortress of light, reinforced glass, and undeniable sophistication. I transformed the sprawling suburban mansion into the premier fine art appraisal gallery of the Midwest, a sanctuary dedicated to authenticity, value, and truth concepts my biological family had never comprehended. The grand opening took place on a crisp, biting December evening, the air shimmering with the promise of a spectacular, unforgiving winter. Valets in sharp-tailored coats navigated a steady stream of luxury sedans up the sweeping circular driveway, parking them where Thomas's repossessed sports cars used to sit. Inside, the transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The grand foyer where my mother had once hosted her superficial, venomous socialite gatherings now featured museum-quality track lighting, illuminating priceless authenticated canvases, and stunning modernist sculptures. The space buzzed with an electric, vibrant energy, filled with a highly curated guest list of international art collectors, influential critics, and the high society clientele who had swiftly and mercilessly abandoned my parents' sinking ship. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite, a massive room that now belonged entirely to me. I wore a tailored midnight blue silk gown that projected effortless, unassailable authority. Reaching into a velvet-lined biometric lockbox on my vanity, I retrieved the ultimate centerpiece of my victory. The flawless heirloom emerald necklace, the very piece Sienna had desperately, violently tried to steal, and Catherine had arrogantly claimed as her own inherent right, rested heavily and beautifully against my collarbone. The deep, rich green stones caught the ambient light, sparkling with the unmistakable, blinding brilliance of reclaimed heritage. I fastened the platinum clasp, feeling the cool metal settle securely against my skin. It was a physical, undeniable reminder that I was no longer the quiet, overlooked daughter waiting for scraps of approval. I was the architect of my own destiny, wearing the spoils of the war they had started. Descending the sweeping modern glass staircase, I was immediately greeted by the warm, genuine smiles of my true chosen family. Inspector Ramirez, the sharp, unyielding investigator who had been instrumental in tracing the accelerants from my burned apartment and cementing Jamal's airtight arson conviction, stood near a stunning, postmodern bronze sculpture. He raised his glass of sparkling cider to me in a silent, respectful salute. He looked entirely at ease among the affluent crowd, his presence a comforting reminder of the relentless factual justice that had brought us to this night. Top-tier federal prosecutors and the senior trust attorneys who now managed my expansive portfolio, with absolute unwavering deference, mingled effortlessly, sharing stories and celebrating the gallery's spectacular launch. However, while the interior of the gallery radiated warmth, success, and the soft melodies of a live string quartet, a starkly different reality played out beyond the illuminated floor-to-ceiling windows. I paused near the reinforced glass of what used to be the formal dining room, gently swirling the champagne in my crystal flute. Standing near the towering wrought iron gates at the very edge of the property, partially obscured by the freezing winter shadows and accumulating snow, was a solitary, wretched figure. I watched Catherine through the glass, her presence entirely separated from my world. She was still wearing her cheap, scratchy polyester grocery store uniform, her shoulders violently shivering beneath a thin, heavily worn, inadequate coat that offered zero protection against the Chicago wind. She clung to the frozen iron bars of the gate, with bare, reddened hands staring desperately up at the glowing windows of the mansion she had once ruled with an iron, manipulative fist. Her face, illuminated briefly by the sweeping headlights of an arriving limousine, was a portrait of absolute agonizing ruin. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair was plastered to her forehead by the sleet, and her eyes were wide with a starving, frantic desperation. She looked like a ghost, haunting the perimeter of a vibrant world that had completely and permanently locked her out. She did not get to linger in her misery for long. A private security guard dressed in a heavy insulated winter coat and an earpiece approached her with polite but uncompromising firmness. I watched as he gestured toward the public sidewalk, calmly instructing her to step away from the private property perimeter. Catherine's shoulders slumped in a display of total, irreversible defeat. She did not argue. She did not scream about her former status or demand to speak to the owner. The fight had been entirely bled out of her by minimum wage shifts and a subsidized reality. She turned away from the warmth, pulling her thin coat tighter against the biting wind, and began the long, freezing walk toward the public bus stop, dissolving into the blackness of the winter night. I felt no pity. I felt no residual guilt. I simply took a sip of my vintage champagne and turned my back on the window, leaving her to the cold. Returning to the center of the gallery, I was immediately surrounded by laughter, congratulations, and the comforting presence of people who valued my intellect and my integrity. I stepped onto the slightly elevated landing near the main exhibition hall and gently tapped my crystal flute with a silver spoon. The low hum of sophisticated conversation gradually faded as the attendees turned their attention toward me, their faces reflecting genuine admiration and respect. To new beginnings, I projected my voice, carrying clearly and confidently across the pristine, illuminated gallery. I looked at Inspector Ramirez, the dedicated legal teams, and the loyal clients who had trusted my vision. We are standing in a space that has been completely, fundamentally transformed. It is a living testament to the fact that no matter how thoroughly something is destroyed, the right foundation can support a masterpiece. I raised my glass higher, the heavy emeralds glittering brilliantly around my neck, reflecting the ambient light like shattered glass. They tried to burn me to keep themselves warm, I said, my voice echoing with absolute unwavering finality. So I took their ashes, and I built an empire. The room erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause, the sound washing over me like a baptism of total vindication. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the crisp scent of expensive catering fresh paint and absolute victory. The terrified, obedient girl who had sat silently at the edge of the Vance family dining table was dead, buried forever under the rubble of their federal indictments and catastrophic bankruptcies. In her place stood a woman of untouchable wealth, immense power, and unapologetic triumph. My family had demanded a sacrifice, but I had delivered a reckoning, and the kingdom was finally entirely mine. The most profound lesson from Cassidy's journey is that true empowerment comes from reclaiming your own narrative. Her family relentlessly tried to define her worth through manipulation, greed, and violence. However, she proved that you never have to remain a victim of toxic bloodlines. Instead of breaking under the weight of betrayal, she weaponized their underestimation. She transformed her trauma into unshakable strength, building an empire from the very ashes of their malice. Never let abusive people dictate your potential or steal your future. Take control of your own life today. Share your story of overcoming adversity and comment below.